Piano Man, written and narrated by Dusty Thunder. There was once a man by the name of Adolf Stranzel who lived in a tiny cottage nestled in the hills of Heisenberg, Germany. He was a loner, a bit of a hermit, who worked during the day at the Steinberg piano factory as a piano builder. While he worked, he spoke to no one, preferring to pour his entire focus into crafting the piano before him. When his work was through, he would make the long walk back home without making eye contact with anyone. The people of Heisenberg knew better than to smile or wave at him, and as people tend to do when they don't know anything about someone or something, they made up their own stories. Some said that a witch had taken his soul, and he was no more than a shell of a man. Some said that he lost his mother at a young age and hadn't spoken since. Some said he was formerly a villainous demon who had been banished to Earth, and if he spoke, it would turn everyone around him to ash. There were tales upon tales. None of them were correct, of course. No, the real story wasn't nearly as magical as all of that. Not at first, anyway. From the time he was a young boy, Adolf had difficulty communicating with other people. He knew what he was feeling. He knew what he wanted to say, yet he couldn't seem to put the words together. Every time he tried, it backfired, often causing confusion, sometimes causing anger, always pushing Adolf deeper into his shell, until one day when Adolf was just 12 years old, he gave up completely. It was later that year that Adolf discovered the piano. His mother, who was genuinely loving and accepting of Adolf just as he was, never pressuring him to venture outside of his shell, had taken him to visit some relatives in a neighboring town. As Adolf walked around the relative's home, avoiding the threat of people trying to converse with him, he noticed something he had never seen before. It was a grand piano. It was majestic, with its proud stature, skin black as night, stark white keys like a bright smile grinning widely at him. Adolf felt drawn to something for the very first time in his life. He wanted so badly to touch it, but his mother had raised him not to touch other people's things without asking, and he couldn't ask, so he just stood there, staring at it, soaking in every visual detail. After several minutes, his mother peeked her head into the room, checking in on him as she often does, and she could tell that the piano had captured his attention. She turned to her cousin and whispered something, presumably asking if she would permit Adolf to touch the piano, and she must have agreed because Adolf's mother smiled at him and gave him a reassuring nod that spoke volumes. Adolf slowly stretched out his shaking hand toward the piano's keys, and with his index finger, gently pressed down on one of them. The resulting sound reverberated through the piano, through the air, into Adolf's ears and landed squarely on his soul. Goosebumps. Adolf looked down at his arm, finger still on the key, to see his hair standing straight on end. He might not have been smiling on the outside, but on the inside, on the inside he was laughing with the purest of joy. He pressed another key, and it struck the resonant frequency in his soul. Another, the same, another, and soon he felt as if he was truly communicating what he felt for the very first time. He became obsessed with piano, or rather the ability to speak through the piano. Adolf's mother brought him back to her cousins as often as she could to give him the opportunity to play, if you could call it that. Adolf's approach to striking the keys of the piano was far from conventional. He wasn't interested in the classic paths for learning to play the instrument, preferring to find his own way and creating his own unique sounds. Eventually, the racket became too much for his mother's cousin, and Adolf wasn't able to come back. His mother, determined to find a way for him to continue down this path, the only path that had shown a glimmer of light in her son's life, managed to get him a job at the local Steinberg piano factory. Their neighbor happened to work at the Steinberg factory, and he explained to his bosses Adolf's unique traits. They decided to let him work as a cleanup boy. This didn't give him much time at the piano, but they did allow him to play during lunch breaks, when the rest of the factory would be empty. Over the years, Adolf watched and learned enough to work his way up to being one of the main builders at Steinberg, still playing during lunch breaks, still otherwise not speaking to anyone. As the years passed, those who helped give Adolf his start at Steinberg, including his mother, passed on. As they exited this world, so did Adolf's story. And so, the people of Heisenberg made up their own. Adolf was completely alone now, isolated in his own world, without anyone recognizing that his world even existed. However, his life was not without meaning. His world was still flourishing. His time playing pianos during lunch breaks at Steinberg gave him a bit of fulfillment, but the thing that really kept him going was a special project that he worked on in his little cabin. Those long walks back home to his cabin were filled with planning and anticipation. You see, Adolf had been working on building his own piano. Opening the door to his little cabin never got old to Adolf because it revealed his magnificent work in progress to his eyes after a long day at the factory. Over the years, it had slowly taken over his entire cabin. He sacrificed his table, his chair, even his bed, all to make room for this piano. Adolf's piano appeared to be near completion. It was a grand, with intricate carvings across every square inch of its skin, even under the lid. It wasn't what you would traditionally call beautiful. It was magnificent, a bold affront to the senses, made from Brazilian rosewood and obsession. The soundboard appeared to be a harp fallen straight from the heavens. The strings glowed with an unnatural iridescence, almost as if there was energy radiating from them without even being struck by the hammers. Instead of the usual 3 pedals, there were 4, one of which was still being constructed. The only thing about this piano that looked remotely normal was the keyboard. Every day when Adolf returned home and entered his tiny little cabin, he removed his coat and hat, hung them on the wall, and stared at his piano for 30 minutes before diving in again on his passion project. As he stood and stared, left arm folded, chin resting on his right hand, you could see the wheels of his mind turning through his eyes. It was the calm before the storm. After 30 minutes was up, and Adolf had the night's plan settled in his mind, he would put on his leather apron, pick up his tools, and walk toward his piano. To see him interact with the piano, one would think it was alive. He approached it slowly, cautiously stretching out his hand as a sign of peace before gently lowering it onto the casing, where he would leave it until he had seemingly been accepted by the piano. It was a ritual that both he and the piano had grown accustomed to. It was a show of respect, the beginning of a dance that both would perform for the next several hours. Every good dance begins with an invitation and acceptance. Interestingly, Adolf hadn't yet played this piano. Sure, it wasn't complete, but it must have taken extraordinary patience and strength not to press a key along the way. To Adolf, this was a sign of reverence. The piano was too special to be played in partial form. The mission was clear. Finish it. Only then would the piano's song be truly as intended. To the naked eye, this piano would look complete. Let's remember, though, Adolf's piano didn't have 3 pedals. It had 4, and one of those wasn't yet completed. It was on this last pedal that Adolf spent the next several hours. With great care, he attached the pieces that he had spent years crafting from scratch. Each piece contained a different intricate carving and possessed the same radiating glow as the strings. Each time a new piece was attached, all of the connected pieces, including the strings, would glow with more intensity. They didn't get brighter, but rather radiated with a faster frequency. As the final pedal was completed, the speed of this radiation seemed to reach a standstill. It now moved at a speed beyond the comprehension of the human eye, and so it disappeared. While Adolf could no longer see the glow, he could feel it. With a deep breath, he inhaled the energy flowing from his creation, and with his exhale, a smile crept over his worn face. His masterpiece was finally ready. He stood there in reverence, taking in the majesty of the final product of his life's work. For hours he stood, inhaling the sweet energy of his creation, overcome with the satisfaction that he had never felt before. He didn't want to waste this feeling or this moment. He held on to them until he could no longer fight the weight of his eyelids. Then, just before the sun came up, Adolf lay down on the floor, right where he stood. He lay on his side, still facing the piano, still fighting the gravity of his eyelids as he tried to soak in every moment of his completed masterpiece's beauty. Bam, 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 bam. A loud knock on Adolf's door startled him out of his deep, exhausted slumber. His face was flooded with confusion. He had never had a visitor to his cabin, ever. Who could this be? Why were they here? Is it purely coincidence that the morning after he completes his masterpiece, someone is banging on his door? He can't let them in. He can't let them see. Climbing to his knees, his hands outstretched in panic, his eyes scanning the room for something, anything to hide his creation with, he finally decides on a course of action. He'll sneak out the back door, quietly. and tiptoed to the side of the house to get a peek at this intruder at his door. He removed his apron and hung it on its hook, careful to step oh so gently to avoid the creaking of his wooden cabin floor as he crept toward the back door. He slowly twisted the doorknob, gently stepped out onto the back step, and then kept the doorknob twisted in between his thumb and forefinger as he slowly pushed the door closed, only then slowly releasing the doorknob to its default state. His eyes scanned the ground around him as he planned out his path. There were dry leaves everywhere. It would be impossible to walk without making a commotion. His back steps were an island, and he was marooned. Should he wait the intruder out? Should he sneak back inside and try to answer the door without letting them see what's inside? He decided that the lowest risk option was to wait them out. So he slumped down on his tiny back steps, and he waited. In what felt like hours, the banging on the door ceased, and he heard the unwanted visitor retreat back toward the town, their steps crunching the leaves more and more distant as their distance from Adolf's cabin grew. He waited another hour before moving. Finally, he stood. Still terrified and confused, he slowly twisted the doorknob once again, stepped inside, and did a quick visual scan to make sure everything was just as he left it. Satisfied that the intruder had not been inside, he slowly opened and peeked through the front door. He didn't expect or want to see anyone or anything, but he had to make sure it was all clear. When the door was halfway open, he saw a note laying on his doormat. The note, a single piece of paper folded in half, had his name, Adolf, scribed on the outer half that faced him. It was beautiful handwriting that reminded him of his mother's writing, each swirl crafted with grace and care. He admired the writing closely as he picked it up gently and walked back inside with it. He hadn't even opened it yet. As he stared, the admiration of lettering faded. And he remembered the hell that had been his past few hours. He remembered the fear that had gripped him. He remembered the night before. He remembered that his creation was now complete. Now he receives a note from a strange visitor. This whirlpool of feelings was too much for him. He had to sit down. He retreated to the corner of his tiny cabin and with his back to the wall, slid down into a balled-up sitting position. He glanced to his creation, then down to the note. He didn't want to open it, but he knew that he had to. The note. Adolf, I was sent by Mr. Fritz Becker to check up on you. Not a single person at Steinberg can recall a day that you were even the slightest bit late, and your absence has caused us all great concern. If you are ill, please let us know. Hopefully, you've already arrived at Steinberg while I've been on this adventure. In that event, please disregard this note. I hope you're well. I've long admired your dedication and passion. Frida. A wave of confusion that quickly turned into panic washed over him. Today was Thursday. In his obsession and exhaustion, he had completely forgotten that he still needed to go to work. He had never missed a day. This was sure to rouse suspicion. Before he could decide on the best course of action, a sense of relief took over. It wasn't an intruder. The visitor wasn't here to steal or destroy his prized creation. It was just Frida. Just Frida? He thought to himself, as his relief turned into bewilderment. Frida was a beautiful widow who worked for Mr. Becker at Steinberg. Adolf had noticed her every day, but he assumed that she didn't even know his name. Of course, he had never spoken to her. He had never spoken to anyone at Steinberg, but she knew him. Not only that, she admired him. He was flattered. He was excited. He was overwhelmed. His distracted gaze turned toward the piano, his magnificent creation, and a switch was flipped. He suddenly remembered that his true life's mission was here, in this cabin, this piano, and it was now ready to put to use. Nothing else really mattered. Not his job at Steinberg, not Frida, only this. It then occurred to him that while the inspiration for the piano's design had come to him through his dreams, he was now at an event horizon. His dreams had only taken him so far as building the piano. He didn't know what was going to happen if and when he actually played it. To this point, he had assumed that the next phase of this journey would be revealed to him through his dreams just as the first phase had been. But there he stood, on the edge of the event horizon, unsure where his path would lead. He only knew one thing for sure. He had to play it. However, he needed to be sure that there would be no interruptions and no one around to hear. With Frida having startled his solitude only hours before, now didn't seem to be the safest time. He would wait for nightfall. Now, he would sleep. He would need his energy to play through the night, and maybe the next phase of his journey would be revealed to him while he slept. Satisfied with this plan, he returned to the floor to sleep once again, this time crawling under his piano. Once he was comfortable, he placed a hand on one of the piano's pedals, much like one would do while sleeping next to their partner, and for the same benefits, comfort, connection, and security. With a series of deep breaths, Adolf coaxed his mind to sleep, slowly drifting into hibernation to prepare for the long journey ahead. The dream. Adolf slowly opened his eyes, feeling as if he had rested a sufficient amount of time. It was dark, which wasn't a surprise. He expected nightfall and had left his lanterns off to not attract any attention in the off chance that another unexpected visitor came prying during his slumber. This darkness was heavy, though. It was infinite. He rubbed his eyes and braced a hand on the floor to push himself upright, holding his other hand above his head to avoid hitting the piano that he had fallen asleep under. His hand slowly stretched upward, expecting to find a rosewood surface, but as it kept stretching upward, it only found emptiness. After passing the point where he was sure a piano should be, he thrust his arm upward in a desperate attempt to touch something, anything, but he touched only darkness. Still unable to see anything but an infinite black void, he quickly dove into a panic. His breath neared hyperventilation within seconds. He sprung to his feet using the floor, the one thing he could feel, and grasped in all directions in frantic desperation. Again, he found nothing. His piano was gone, and he was trapped in an infinite void. Defeated, destroyed, with the only thing that mattered taken from him, he collapsed to the ground and he wept. For hours he wept, eventually curling up into a fetal position, accepting that he would be stuck in this purgatory for eternity. In time he could weep no more. He had no more tears to give. Closing his eyes only brought more darkness, so he left them open. He stared into nothing. He felt nothing. He thought nothing. Then, when he had nothing left to give, he saw a faint figure in the distance of the void coming toward him. It was a tiny white speck that grew larger each second, and as it drew nearer, the growing size was accompanied by the growing sound of a 3-beat pace. Ba-da-ba, ba-da-ba, ba-da-ba. Adolf forced himself up into a sitting position and squinted to get a clearer picture of whatever was headed toward him. The 3-beat pace continued with growing intensity, and the blurry figure slowly became clear. Galloping toward him was a stunning white mare with a mane that flowed in slow motion and glowed with the same iridescence as Adolf's piano strings. It let out a deafening whinny as it charged nearer, and as it became clear to Adolf that this mare was going to run him down, he collapsed back to the ground and balled up to protect his head. As the 3-beat pace sounded like they would be trampling him any second, everything stopped. A deafening silence hit Adolf with the same shock as the mare's trampling hooves would have, and he let out a cry as he flinched in anticipation of pain. He wasn't injured, but he was even more confused than he had been since being trapped in this darkness. Where did the mare go? It was charging toward him. It sounded as if it were right on top of him. Now it had vanished? He leapt to his feet and scanned the darkness around him to find the white mare once again. Eyes squinting, he turned slowly in a circle, searching for the white speck. When he had turned all the way around, his eyes locked with the mare's, just inches away. Adolf screamed and fell to the ground as he tried to run. As he frantically brought his eyes back to where the mare had stared him down, the mare had vanished, but in its place, a rocking chair, occupied by his mother. Adolf was on the ground, distraught and confused, but there she was, his mother, just 5 feet away. Focused on the scarf she was intently knitting. Tears immediately began to form in his eyes, and he rubbed them, sure that he was seeing something that wasn't there. He shook his head, trying to jar the image from his mind, but no matter what he did, there she was. When he had accepted that he wasn't just seeing things, he began to push himself back up to his feet. His heart was pounding even harder now. His eyes were fixed on his mother, but she hadn't noticed him. She was still intently knitting. Before taking a step, he looked all around, checking the horizon for the white mare once more. When his eyes returned to his mother, her gaze was locked on him. Tears welled again. His lip quivered. It had been many years since his mother passed. How was this possible? She looked just the way he remembered when he was young. She was much younger than when she passed. She wore a dark blue dirndl and a cloak. And once he couldn't remember, she wore a dark blue dirndl and a cloak, one he couldn't remember seeing before. draped over the back of her head, shoulders, and back. Her head tilted, and she looked into his now blubbering face with motherly care. "Adolf," she calmly spoke, just as she had always done when he was upset. "You did it." Hearing her voice sent Adolf into a further downfall, tears now streaming, spittle now leaked from his quivering, pouted lips. "You finished the piano. You did it." She spoke again with the softness of a mother comforting a baby. Adolf fell to his knees in emotional surrender. His mother slowly stood from the rocking chair, placing her knitting on the seat, and then turned back toward her son. She appeared to be around the same age as Adolf, but she still saw him as her boy. She slowly stepped toward him. Adolf's head now hung in shame for the tearful display he had let escape his face. His mother shouldn't see him like this, but he couldn't stop any of it. He felt her warm hand cup his cheek. "Did you hear me, Adolf? You succeeded. Why do you cry?" She spoke in a tender but proud tone, like a mother trying to convince her toddler that he wasn't in trouble. Her hand guided his gaze upward to meet hers. She held out her other hand for him to grab onto, helping him climb to his feet. Her hands were soft, just like he remembered. He stood and took a deep breath, trying his best to collect himself, wiping away the tears and spittle. She gave him a tender smile, her hands now reaching out for him to hold. "I knew you could do it." Adolf experienced a wave of emotions, leaving him even more confused than he had been to this point. He was happy to see his mother, but he was also saddened, experiencing the grief of losing her all over again in a single moment. He was proud that she was proud of him, but he didn't understand how she knew about the piano, or how she was here, or where the piano went, or where he was, or where the mare had gone. He felt many things in this moment, but the emotion that overcame all others was bewilderment. His mother always knew what he was thinking. He didn't have to speak, and she never pressured him to, knowing that he struggled so much with words. "I know you're confused," she assured, now grabbing his hands and holding them in hers, "but I can explain everything." Adolf's eyes still welled with tears, but he nodded slightly, acknowledging her offer to explain. "Those dreams that showed you how to build your piano?" She spoke softly, taking care to not further excite her son's fragile state. "I sent those dreams to you." Adolf's eyes looked down and to the side, searching his mind for any sign of his mother in those dreams, but there was no sign. He didn't remember much about those dreams, just that he awoke inspired with a specific direction about how to build this piano, which was unlike anything he had ever crafted before. "I didn't reveal myself in those dreams," she explained, answering the question that she could see brewing in his mind. "You weren't ready for that yet, but now you've completed building the piano. You're ready now." His eyes delivered another question. Ready for what? "Ready to speak," she replied with the same delicate touch, but this time with more finality. She sought to instill confidence in him with her words. His eyes flooded with more questions. How? What does this mean? What am I supposed to do next? She smiled. He was the same curious boy, just in an older man's body now. "Just play it. Everything will be revealed in time." Her smile lifted her words with a tone like a parent telling a child to open a gift. He was still confused, but he nodded at her instructions. He would play it, but he didn't know where the piano was or where he was for that matter. "This place is part of your dream." Still holding his hands, she looked around at the black void. "I'm not a dream. I'm here. You can feel that I'm real, but I can only visit you in this place, and this place is a stage. Your dreams are all played here, like a theater production. When you awake, you will remember this. But all you need to know is that you're ready to speak, and your piano will make that possible." A tear fell down Adolf's cheek because he now knew that he must wake. He must leave his mother behind in this void. She released his hands to wipe a tear from his cheek. "You will see me again, here in this place, but for now, you must go. It's time for you to speak." She leaned in and kissed his forehead. He closed his eyes, trembling with equal parts happiness and sorrow at the feeling of her kiss. When he opened his eyes to gaze upon her once more, she was gone. He searched frantically for her, not ready to say goodbye, but he did not see her in the void. Instead, he saw a bright light on the horizon of the void, like a sun rising, but it was much faster than the sun, and it soon filled the void with a blinding white light. He shielded his eyes from the intense beams, and at the moment that it felt as if the brightness may actually blind him, even with his hands shielding his eyes and his eyes closed, he awoke. He was on his cabin floor, underneath his piano, right where he had curled up to sleep. No light pierced through his windows now. It was night, a black, still night. He felt the piano above him, and with a deep sigh he accepted all that had just happened. He had seen his mother in the void, and she had instructed him to play his piano. He was ready to speak. He slid himself out from under the piano, slowly standing as he dusted himself off. He lit every lantern and candle he could find in his little cabin. This was an occasion that would require more than light for the function of sight. It needed a ceremonial ambiance. With his cabin aglow and the tiny flickers of dozens of candles surrounding the ceremony space, he put all of his tools away. He swept the dust from the floor. He had to make this space worthy of the moment, and he had to make himself worthy as well. He used a washcloth to clean the dust from his face, neck, and hands. He combed his unkempt hair. He washed his hands with the thoroughness of a doctor preparing for surgery. Finally, he was ready. He slowly approached the piano, pulling the bench back enough to slide in front, and he slowly lowered himself, pulling the bench forward to meet the bend of his knees. Once seated, he rested his hands on the leather of the bench, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. He remembered seeing his mother and what she had told him. "You're ready to speak, and your piano will make that possible." The image of his mother was burned into his mind. Every time his thoughts glanced her direction, tears welled. This moment held such gravity, he needed another deep, slow breath. His unsure hands finally arose from the bench, trembling as they traveled to the keys. They rested on the ivory and ebony of the keyboard, weightless. He looked up, closed his eyes, and pressed his fingers down with the gentle uncertainty. It was a beautiful chord, one he used often when he was able to tinker on the pianos at Steinberg. And from this piano, it was even more beautiful. He held his fingers in place, soaking up the vibration that his piano collected in its chamber and released to him. He held, absorbing the sound and waiting for something magical. He waited to finally speak as the chord gradually faded into nothing, and he waited for a full minute even after it was gone. He did not speak. Nothing magical had occurred. It was a beautiful chord, but nothing more. Adolf was bewildered. What had he done wrong? He had followed the instructions from his dreams with great care, but it wasn't working. He remembered the magical glow that the strings had radiated, and how the glow had increased in intensity as he completed the last pedal. "That's it," he thought. He didn't speak the words, but the sudden widening of his eyes spoke louder than words ever could. A great cloak had been pulled from the mystery, and he now realized that the fourth pedal was the key to engaging the piano's magical abilities. He looked down at the pedals under his feet. On the far left, the una corda pedal, or soft pedal, struck only one string instead of the usual three, resulting in a softer, muted note. Next to it, the sostenuto pedal held notes that are already being played when the pedal is depressed. Next to it, in what is usually the far right side, the sustain pedal removed the dampers from the strings, allowing the notes to ring out longer. Next to it, the fourth pedal, Adolf's enchanted pedal, was the key to allowing him to unlock the piano's ability to help him speak. Adolf understood the mechanics of the normal three pedals quite well. After all, that was his job. However, he couldn't recall the fourth pedal engaging anything differently in the strings. There were no additional dampers connected to the pedal, nothing that would physically engage the strings in a different way. Even though he had built the piano and crafted this enchanted pedal, he wasn't sure how it was going to work. With anticipation and now perspiration dripping from his brow, Adolf depressed the fourth pedal with his right foot. He took another deep breath, lifted his hands above the keys, and let them come crashing down onto the ivory and ebony with the intensity and force of a general sending all of his soldiers into battle in one motion. He put everything he had into this chord, a C major 9, also called the heaven chord. The piano unleashed an overwhelming wave of energy. Adolf felt this rush through his body, starting at both his hands and his feet. flying inward toward his center where the waves crashed together, sending his head flying backward and reverberating the most beautiful, heavenly sound from deep within his chest. He wasn't just speaking, he was singing. He wasn't just singing, he was channeling what sounded like a host of angels from within him. The piano's chord was more than a chord. It surged energy throughout the entire room through waves of sound that were unlike anything Adolf had ever heard come from a piano. It was unnaturally beautiful, and the voice coming from within him flowed perfectly with its song. Together, they were an army of orchestras played by the soldiers of heaven. His fingers were still depressing the keys. His head was still thrown back. He had no control over what was happening. He couldn't let go. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't. When he was finally able to lift his hands from the keys and foot from the pedal, he collapsed to the floor, and he wept. It was beautiful, but it had taken everything out of him. He was now completely, mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually exhausted. Tears still pouring from his eyes, which were locked in a dead gaze. Body lying still on the floor in a fetal position, he fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. Adolf abruptly awoke to the sound of the mare whinnying, as it had the last time he saw it, when it nearly trampled him. He sat up in a panic and searched in fear for the mare that might be barreling toward him again. He was in the infinite darkness once again. He stood to his feet, still searching for the mare, and as he turned nearly the entire way around, he was deathly startled to see his mother only inches from his face. He let out a sort of shriek, and she just smiled. It was the kind of smile that a mother makes when her baby has done something endearing. She held out her arms in an invitation for embrace, hands open and palms up, ready to accept his hands. Adolf wiped the tears from his eyes and laughed at himself in embarrassment. He felt foolish for being scared of his own mother. "I'm so proud of you, my boy." His mother always had a way of delivering words in the most tender of tones. Her eyes soothed as much as her tone did. He immediately felt at ease and placed his hands in hers. His eyes still welled with tears, but these were different tears, happy tears. He wondered if he would ever get used to seeing his mother again. She pulled him close and wrapped her arms around him. It was the embrace of a mother and son who had not seen each other in many years, as if he had been mistakenly presumed dead during the war and somehow returned to her years later. She held him tight. He buried himself in her embrace. She swayed with him gently, like a mother rocking her baby to sleep, and held the back of his head as he nested into her embrace. "I know that you're exhausted," she whispered reassuringly, "but I can help you." Adolf lifted his head with a confused look on his face. How could she prevent the piano from draining him of everything? She took a step back and held his hands once again, taking the familiar stance of a mother who was about to teach her child something important. She smiled. "You have to play the piano in front of someone." She delivered this news while holding her smile, but her eyes now conveyed concern. She knew that Adolf wouldn't want to play in front of anyone, but she also knew that he must overcome this fear in order to speak again. Adolf's confusion turned into rejection at hearing this. He let go of her hands and began to pace, shaking his head no. He wasn't comfortable playing in front of people. She knew that. Why would she ask this of him? "I know you're scared," she said, reaching for his hands once again, and when she was able to clasp onto one of his hands, followed with, "But it's the only way." He stopped pacing, looked intently at her hand, and then slowly brought his gaze to her eyes, delivering a look that ensured she knew how big of an ask this was for him. She smiled and gave a muted laugh. "Oh, I know you hate this, and if there was any other way, you know that I would tell you." Her eyes now delivered authentic concern. She wanted him to know through this look that she understood, and she wanted him to understand in return. Adolf breathed in deeply and let out a long, defeated sigh that dropped his head and his shoulders simultaneously. His mother moved in for another embrace, a reward for his acceptance of this path where he had no choice but to face his fear. Head still hung in defeated acceptance, the next complication occurred to him. How would he choose a person to play for? He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't have friends. He didn't have anyone. His mother, sensing the arrival of this question, leaned back once more and looked him in the eyes to reassure him. "Someone will appear who will ask you to play your piano for them. You simply have to oblige." Her smile at this point came with a sense of finality. It was decided. There was no other way. "Come now," she said. turning away from him as if they were headed out the door to run an errand. "It's time." She began to walk away from Adolf, but he knew that they were in an infinite darkness. Where would they be walking? He looked around for a sign, a door, something, but when he looked back to his mother, she was gone, and the blinding light that had once filled the dark void appeared again. This time, it didn't rise slowly like the sun. It arrived quickly, barely giving him enough time to shield his eyes, knocking him to the ground. He awoke on the ground in his cabin, right where he had fallen off his piano bench, still in the fetal position, tears still streaming from his open eyes. He let out a gasp, as if he was just now resurfacing after being underwater for far too long, sat up, and looked around to figure out what was happening. He saw his piano, and he knew what had happened. He continued to sit there, rubbing his eyes to reset them from all that had just occurred. He stood, brushed himself off, looked at his piano with an understanding of what would happen next, and then began blowing out all of the ceremonial candles and lanterns that had illuminated his space. He had experienced enough speaking for one night, and it was nearly dawn. Bam, 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 bam! Adolf was startled awake once more. He expected to open his eyes to the dark void once again, but he was on the floor in his tiny cabin, and someone was at his door, again. The flood of questions that accompanied the first visitor's knocking didn't arrive this time. He knew who it was. It was Frida, coming to check on him again. The last time she had come by, the first time someone had knocked on his door in ages, he had hidden and waited for her to leave. She had left that thoughtful note. He couldn't do that to her again. He at least wanted to assure her that he was alive and well, or at least okay. He pushed himself to his feet, dusted himself off, combed his hair quickly with his hands, and marched toward the door. Outside, Frida was even more concerned than she was during her first visit. She leaned from the doorstep toward the window just right of the door, trying to catch a glimpse of activity to put her mind at ease. She was bundled up for her walk through the brisk autumn forest to Adolf's cabin. Her breath formed clouds of concern as she sighed. Her nose was a bright pink, and her eyes glistened. She wasn't going to let the cold stop her from checking in on Adolf. Frida was still leaning over, trying to get a peek through the window. When the door swung open, she was so startled that she nearly fell over and let out an "Oh!" Adolf lunged forward to catch her, bracing her arm to keep her from fully falling down. She looked at his face with surprise and delight. He helped her upright, and she quickly straightened her appearance to recover from the near mishap, clearing her throat to regain her composure. "Yes, well, thank you." She did her best to speak pleasantly, even though she was embarrassed. The embarrassment quickly disappeared from her face and was replaced with concern. She was relieved to see Adolf, but she was still concerned at his absence from Steinberg, and now that she could see that he was okay, she was a bit annoyed at him. "Adolf, where have you been? What's going on?" She asked the questions, even though she knew he could not speak to answer. She stared into his eyes while she awaited a response. Adolf pressed his palm to his forehead and then to his throat, signaling that he had not been feeling well, then gave a shrug, the kind of shrug that comes after an obvious fib. While his arms were moving about, Frida caught a glimpse of the piano behind him. He had forgotten to cover it before opening the door. Her eyes widened and her mouth dropped open. "Heavens, Adolf, did you build this?" She pointed to the piano behind him. Realizing that there was no turning back now, he sheepishly nodded in the affirmative, turning to the side to give her a better view of his masterpiece. "May I look closely?" Frida couldn't resist. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, but she knew that Adolf was a loner and that she was asking a lot of him to enter his space. She awaited his cue with an anticipated gaze. Without thinking, Adolf nodded with confidence, outstretching his left arm to show her the way, even though the cabin was tiny, and there was only one direction to go. He offered his right hand to her, palm up, a welcoming gesture and a chivalrous utility to help her step over the threshold. Frida's gaze drifted from his face to his open hand. She placed her gloved hand in his and stepped inside the tiny cabin. As she stepped into Adolf's humble dwelling, she was amazed. It was covered in candles and lanterns. None were lit, but they clearly had been recently. Wax capes were formed on each candle. Hardened pools of wax dotted the floor, and there in the center of it all was the most magnificent piano she had ever laid eyes on. Every inch of its surface was hand-carved, and it had a certain magnetism to it. She was drawn to step closer. Adolf stopped her by stepping in front of her and offering to take her coat. "Oh, yes, of course, thank you." she remitted in a pleasant but distracted tone. She removed her coat, scarf, gloves, and hat, and while Adolf was hanging them all by the door with great care, Frida walked around the piano, hands behind her back, eyes scanning every inch of its surface in amazement. When Adolf finished hanging her garments, he turned toward Frida and the piano. She was now facing him and smiling from ear to ear. "Adolf, this is amazing." She delivered the compliment, making sure to keep eye contact with him so that he understood the gravity of her words, then looking to the piano once more. "I would very much like to hear you play it." She spoke with a softer tone now. She knew that Adolf played the piano because she had listened to him while he tinkered on lunch breaks at Steinberg when everyone else was supposed to be off of the production floor. She liked to find a comfortable hiding spot to listen while she ate her lunch. It was one of her hidden guilty pleasures. Adolf was caught off guard. He shook his head and hands in a modest, no. But Frida insisted. "Please, Adolf, I wouldn't forgive myself if I came all this way, saw this beautiful creation, and didn't hear you play it." She called in the reinforcements of her eyelashes now, batting them to wrap her words with intoxicating flirtation. His heart fluttered. He felt his body temperature rise 3 degrees, and the hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He looked to the ground, then back to Frida, nodding in agreement with a timid smile. She curtsied in excited appreciation and looked around the room for a chair to sit in. Adolf scurried to the back of the cabin, removed some of his tools from the single chair that he owned, and he brought it out to her. He placed it to the right of the piano bench, arm's length away from the edge of the piano, and with both hands he motioned for her to have a seat. As she took a seat, he was sure to hold the back of the chair in chivalrous support. She had a grin on her face. His disheveled chivalry was endearing. With Frida seated, Adolf sat himself on the piano bench and prepared to play for her. He wasn't sure what he was going to play for her. He hadn't gotten that far in his mind yet, only just accepting the fact that he was going to play. He looked over at Frida, seated out of his forward-facing view, who was waiting with anticipation to hear how he would put this majestic piano to use. He grinned nervously, then looked back down to the piano keys before him. He lifted his hands above the keys, still without having decided what he was about to play, then delicately lowered them to the ivory and ebony, pressing a combination of notes that he didn't plan, but they were beautiful. Frida let the sound waves wash over her and closed her eyes, soaking in the full auditory experience. Adolf continued on with his unplanned melody, a delicate song, a tender journey through the piano's octaves. As he played, his improvised song began to build intensity, heading towards some event horizon that he hadn't yet decided. His hands played with increasing fervor as his song crescendoed through time. Something inside of him was guiding this song. He played as if he had written this song ages ago and played it 1,000 times. It was rehearsed, but it wasn't. Frida continued to enjoy her role as a passenger on this journey, allowing the song to reverberate through her body, grinning with ultimate content. As Adolf's hands played without needing the direction of his mind, he remembered his mother. He remembered the most recent encounter with her. He remembered how she said that he had to play his piano for someone to speak without it draining him, and how she said that someone would appear. He opened his eyes, staring straight ahead while his hands played on without him. How did she know that Frida would return? Had his mother appeared to Frida as well? He looked out of the corner of his eye toward Frida, whose eyes were still closed as she enjoyed the beautiful song that his hands and piano serenaded her with. His foot slowly moved toward the 4th pedal, hovering above it as the song played on, continuing to build towards some moment, a moment that he now understood. As the song's phrase ended at the ultimate intensity, his foot thrusted downward on the 4th pedal, and his hand struck the heaven chord with determined ferocity. The army of orchestras flowed from the piano, and Adolf's head was thrust back again. The waves of energy flowed from his hands and his feet, just as before, and crashed together in his chest to unleash a heavenly song from within him. The whole cabin vibrated with energy, and Frida's eyes jolted open as she gasped in surprise. It was startlingly beautiful, more so than she had ever witnessed. Suddenly, her torso lurched forward as her back arched. Something was happening to her. Adolf continued his song, an army of heavenly orchestras pouring from his piano and a heavenly voice singing from deep within him. Frida was frightened now. She was frozen, unable to move anything but her eyes. Her back still arched, her mouth was now stuck open in shock, and she could feel something from within her being pulled out. She let out an involuntary moan as whatever was being pulled from her increased in intensity. Her eyes now streamed with tears. She was powerless. She could now see the stream of energy being pulled from within her flowing toward the piano. She could see the piano strings and pedals glowing with ethereal light. Adolf couldn't see what was happening to Frida. He was stuck in his own way, locked into the gravitational pull of the angelic song. More and more energy flowed from Frida to the piano. The involuntary moan and tears continued, as what she could now determine was her essence, her life, her soul, was being pulled away from her. She was terrified, desperate to break free from the grip of this dark magic, but she was powerless, watching as her soul was stolen from her. Adolf continued on with his song, head still flung back, eyes still closed, hands hammering away at the keyboard while everything around him continued to vibrate with growing intensity. He was oblivious that Frida was being robbed of her soul, that her essence was the energy source that was allowing him to continue playing without being drained himself. The color drained from Frida as the last of her essence left her body. Adolf ended his song and opened his eyes just as the last vapor of life flowed through the air from Frida to the piano. He didn't realize what had happened. He only knew that he hadn't collapsed like he had the last time. It worked. His mother was right. He was pleased with his success and that he had given Frida a magical private concert. He looked down at his hands and nodded with satisfaction, then turned to look at Frida, eager to see her reaction to what he had just shown her. Instead of the awe that he expected to see on her beautiful face, he saw her lying on the floor, gray, lifeless. Frida was gone. Adolf jumped to his feet, hands to his head in shock. Tears streamed from his eyes, and one hand covered his mouth in disbelief. He couldn't believe his eyes. He trembled with fear. What had he done? He slowly approached her lifeless body as a crying groan escaped him. He collapsed on the ground next to her, laying his head on the seat of the chair that she had sat in just moments ago while he wept. As he wept, he became angry at the world, at himself, at his mother. He threw his hands upward to the heavens and let out a primal scream. Why had this happened? His mother had told him that letting someone listen would allow him to speak without draining him, but she didn't tell him that it would use their life force to do it, that it would take all of their life force. She didn't tell him that he was going to become a murderer. Why would she do this to him? Why would she allow her son to become this? Defeated, he slowly made his way to his feet, wiping his tears and nose on his sleeve. He couldn't leave Frida here. She deserved a proper burial. She didn't deserve any of this, but he would at least give her a grave. Head hung in shame, Adolf dragged his shovel through the leaves in the cold afternoon light. He walked deeper into the woods until he could no longer see anything but trees, and he began to dig. With each thrust of the shovel, he cursed himself more. He cursed the world. He cursed his mother. He was so lost in his own mind that he didn't realize he was digging. For hours, he took his frustration out on the dirt below him until he had created a massive crater in the middle of the woods. Realizing that he had gone far enough, he climbed out of the hole, threw down his shovel, and began to trudge back toward his cabin, head still hung in shame, to retrieve Frida's body. When he re-entered the cabin, everything was just as he had left it. He had hoped that somehow the horrific scene that was now burned into his mind would just vanish, but it didn't. Frida was still there on the ground, a lifeless gray pile. The bright cheer that she had brought to the world, to Adolf, had been stolen from her, and he was the one who took it. Adolf, his piano, and his mother were to blame for this unspeakable atrocity. He looked at his piano, and for a moment, he thought about taking an axe to it. But he didn't have the energy after hours of digging, and he still had to carry Frida's body through the woods to bury her. He would deal with the piano later. He grabbed an old blanket and draped it over Frida's body. It wasn't big enough to completely wrap her up, but he was really only concerned about covering her face. He didn't want to see her or feel like she was looking at him as he carried her through the forest and buried her. He was emotionally numb by this point, but he had enough wits about him to prevent further emotional triggers or trauma. It was bad enough already. With her body covered by the blanket, he picked her up and threw her over his shoulder. She was lighter than he thought. perhaps because her life had been drained from her. This thought triggered a replay in his mind. He remembered seeing a trail of energy flow from her direction toward the piano as he opened his eyes, but he hadn't turned toward her immediately. By the time he did, she was already on the floor, lifeless. Could he have prevented this if he had looked her way sooner? He carried her through the forest, with leaves and possibilities crunching along the way. He thought of every possible misstep, every potential missed opportunity for a different outcome. By the time he arrived at the gravesite, he was even more determined that his mother had led him astray, and he planned to confront her about it later. He slowly laid Frida's body into the crater that he had dug earlier. He didn't have flowers or words. He didn't even have any tears left to offer. He looked completely disheveled. She deserved so much better than this. He could do nothing but lower his head, fold his hands, and dedicate a moment of silence to Frida. After several minutes of being completely still and silent, he leaned down, picked up a shovel once more, and began to cover her body with earth. It took much longer than he had thought it might. He had dug so much earlier that the amount of dirt to return to the hole was daunting. He didn't have the rage as fuel that he had earlier. He was tired. His body ached. His heart cried. Finally, it was done. A small mound was now Frida's gravesite, and only Adolf would know where she was laid to rest. He couldn't risk a marker or flowers giving away the site to any unsuspecting forest wanderer, so he covered it with the leaves, making it match the surrounding scene as best he could. When he was done, he dragged his shovel back through the forest to his cottage, exhausted and defeated. When he finally returned, he didn't wash the dirt from his body. He didn't take the time or energy to do anything at all. He just laid back down on the floor, ready to face his mother in the darkness and ask her why. He forced his eyes closed and drifted into an exhausted sleep, lying in the same spot where Frida had her life stolen from her just hours ago. Adolf was startled to attention by the deafening whinny of the mare. He was in the dark void again, but the mare hadn't appeared the last time he was there. He remembered that it nearly trampled him, so he frantically searched for any sign of the mare or his mother. He turned just in time to see the mare barreling down at him at full speed with a mighty squeal. Adolf fell to the ground, using one arm to brace his fall and the other to shield his head. Just as before, he was not trampled. Just as before, the mare had vanished. Just as before, he searched for any sign of the mare, but instead, he found his mother, sitting in the rocking chair, knitting away. Instantly forgetting the mare, he marched toward his mother, determined to get answers for what had happened to Frida. His brow furrowed, he approached his mother with visible ire. She did not look up from her knitting, but she spoke to him. "I know you're upset, Adolf," she said in a tender, understanding tone. "It was the only way. It is the only way." She looked up at him and laid down her knitting in her lap. "I know this is difficult to understand, but you've begun the journey to truly speaking again. You can't stop now." Adolf was bewildered. What did her words mean? Did she expect him to take another person's soul? He turned away from her, hands covering his face in disbelief. She placed her knitting aside and stood, letting out a deep sigh and tilting her head as she said, "It won't be this way forever." She stepped toward him, placing her hand on his back. Her touch made him weep. He needed his mother, but not like this. He couldn't kill. He wasn't this person. He shook his head, rejecting the idea that she was pushing upon him. "Adolf, listen to me," she pled. "Once you have 13 souls, you'll never have to take another, and you'll be able to speak forever, to sing forever." He turned toward her, his eyes wide, his face in utter distress. 13? The words left his mouth before he realized what had happened. He was always able to make sounds, but words, actual words, had been nearly impossible for him. This word was as clear as the summer sky. He had spoken. The shock at what he had just done quickly overshadowed the shock at his mother's words. His hand covered his mouth. He was stunned. "You see," his mother said with a hint of a grin, "you're already on your way there." She held out her hands in invitation again, but he did not accept. Adolf paced, mouth still covered, still stunned, but the news of 12 more souls needed for him to speak forever was flooding back quickly. He wasn't capable of such a thing. His mother knows that. Why would she ask this of him? He turned slowly toward her. With great determination, he pushed his lips together to form a word and blurted out, "Why?" He shook his finger at her, demanding an answer. She looked at his finger like a mother would when their child had crossed a line of respect, raising an eyebrow as a warning. "It's what you wanted, dear. It's what you've always wanted, more than anything." Adolf's face faded from stern to damaged confusion. "No," he objected, clearly. "To speak," his mother clarified, "not to kill. But there's a price for everything in this world, my dear Adolf, and I would offer up 1,000 souls for you to have the one thing you've always wanted." She spoke with a certain level of pride in her willingness to sacrifice others for him. Offer? To who? He now knew that there was someone or something else at play here, and he demanded to know who or what it was. His mother looked down and to the side, clearly hiding something that she didn't intend to reveal to Adolf. With a deep breath, she composed herself and looked back at him. "All you need to know is that someone will appear and ask you to play. You simply need to oblige." Her words were short now. The tender wrapper that usually accompanied her words to Adolf was now gone. She was now giving him orders. He shook his head, denying the path that she laid out before him. "If you do not oblige, they will find Frida's body and you will live out your days breaking rocks in a Zuchthaus," she warned sternly. Adolf hung his head. It seemed that he was destined for a prison of one kind or another. His mother cleared her throat, resetting her body language and voice tone to the sweet and gentle mother that she had previously presented. "I believe in you, Adolf." She squeezed his shoulder to punctuate her words with finality. Before he could respond, the bright light that marked the closing of his time in the void quickly appeared, blinding him and abruptly ending the conversation. He awoke on the floor of his cottage, lying in the spot where Frida had been taken from him, shielding his eyes from the blinding light that was forcing him out of the world of darkness to the cruelty of reality, a reality where he was responsible for Frida's death. He traded her life and betrayed his own principles, and for what? To speak? He didn't want to speak. He didn't care about that now. He didn't care about anything. He was now numb to both worlds, succumbed to gravity, defeated. He was an empty shell. And he wondered if maybe he always was. Something out of focus in his vision, on the floor just inches from his face, caught his eyes. He leaned back slightly to bring it into focus. It was a single long hair, dark with several turns. It once played a part as a member of a big, beautiful curl, but now it was alone. It was lost, abandoned, numb to the world. It was all that remained of Frida. He wanted to cry, but he had no tears left. He had no sorrow left. He had no hope. And without hope, he had nothing to give at all. It was deep into the night now. Without moving, Adolf's mind replayed what his mother had said over and over. 12 more souls for him to speak forever. He wouldn't do it. He couldn't. She said, offer up, but wouldn't explain. Offer to who? To what? She said that he can't stop now. Would something terrible happen if he did? She said, if you do not oblige, they will find Frida. Who will find her? How? Was his mother threatening to tell someone? Was she being coerced by the person or thing that the souls were being offered to? How was this happening to him? To his mother? How was she capable of asking these things of him? She wasn't. He knew that in his bones. Either someone or something was forcing her to play along, or it wasn't his mother at all. It was Monday morning at the Steinberg piano factory. The production floor began to bustle with commotion as workers flocked in and began their tasks that would start the engine of creation at Steinberg, among them, Adolf. He settled into his station, making sure to line his tools up and situate his space just the way he liked it. "Good to see you, Adolf." Otto, the young man who was in charge of making sure Adolf had all of the supplies he needed to keep building smoothly, was happy to see that he had returned. "Were you ill?" Adolf gave Otto a quick, sheepish glance and then nodded, confirming his absence was due to an illness. "Ah, well, I'll be sure to keep my distance," Otto joked, quickly turning away and scurrying off to grab more supplies. Adolf buried himself in his work, hunched over with his upper half in the main cavity of the currently in-progress piano build, securing the final set of strings in the piano, but the madness of the past few days haunted him. His last encounter with his mother played over and over in his mind, separated by startling visions of Frida laying lifeless on the ground or being covered with dirt as he buried her. Covering her face didn't do much to prevent further trauma. Every terrible image was now seared into his mind. He couldn't unsee them. In his distracted state, his elbow bumped the prop that was holding up the lid to the piano, and the heavy lid came crashing down on top of him. The force of the lid hitting the back of Adolf's head drove his face into the taut strings inside the piano's chamber, and he let out a terrible scream that echoed throughout the entire building. "Help!" Adolf pleaded. Everything and everyone froze. They couldn't believe their ears. Adolf had spoken. Of course, what had happened was terrible and shocking, but hearing Adolf speak for the first time was even more shocking. "Please!" Adolf pleaded again, while the lower half of his body flailed outside of the piano. Everyone in the factory looked at each other, realizing that they had all experienced the same shock about the same thing. Adolf speaking, then sprang into action. 30 men rushed toward Adolf. A few slowly began raising the piano lid as Adolf continued groaning in agony. A few more men slowly pulled Adolf's body out of the piano and laid him on the ground. His face was striped with bloody lines. The back of his head now sported a massive goose egg. The crowd gathered around him to see the carnage, and to see if Adolf might speak again. He didn't. He just continued groaning, clutching the back of his head with one hand and shielding his face with the other. It hurt too badly to touch. He could barely open his eyes, but when he did, he saw enough from the expressions of those huddled around him to know that it was bad. Mr. Becker, factory manager at Steinberg, had heard the commotion from his office on the other end of the building and rushed onto the production floor, fighting through the crowd to see what had happened. "What's going on here? Is everyone okay?" He hadn't seen that it was Adolf who was hurt, and when he finally broke through the crowd and saw Adolf lying there, bloodied up, he covered his mouth in shock. "Oh no," Adolf groaned, seeing Mr. Becker through his barely open eyes. Mr. Becker's shock compounded at hearing Adolf speak. He looked around the crowd, now understanding the level of shock each of their faces showed, and without speaking, questioned them to be sure that they had also heard him speak. Several of the onlookers raised eyebrows back at Mr. Becker, confirming that they had heard the same. "Quick, grab that canvas." Mr. Becker began barking orders to tend to Adolf. He took the canvas and balled it up to put under Adolf's head. He sent another worker for a wet washcloth so they could begin cleaning up Adolf's face, and another to fetch the Heisenberg doctor, whose office was nearby. "Everyone else, back to work." The crowd slowly began to disperse, but they didn't stop paying attention, even after they made it back to their stations. Mr. Becker dabbed the washcloth on Adolf's face, soaking up the bloody smears and revealing the perfectly spaced lines made by the piano strings. "Just lay still, Adolf. The doctor will be here soon, and he'll get you fixed up." Mr. Becker spoke softly, trying to comfort Adolf. "I'm sorry," Adolf blubbered. "Sorry for what?" Mr. Becker responded, trying his best to ignore the fact that Adolf was indeed speaking again. "The piano," Adolf blubbered harder, angry with himself for damaging the piano he had been working on. Mr. Becker shook his head. "Everything is fixable. I'm concerned about you." Just then, the doctor rushed in with his bag, and seeing Adolf, removed his hat and coat, rolled up his sleeves, and asked Mr. Becker to have some men move Adolf to a more private setting. Mr. Becker directed his workers, and they carried Adolf off to Mr. Becker's office. Mr. Becker paced outside his office while the doctor tended to Adolf. He was with him for quite a long time, but he saw the damage and knew it would take some time to address. While he paced, he thought about everything that had happened. Had Adolf always been able to speak? If so, why wouldn't he have done so prior to today? If not, what changed? He looked over at Frida's desk, which sat right outside his office door, ready to ask her if she had noticed anything when she went to check up on him last week, but Frida wasn't there. His heart sank. He remembered that she hadn't returned to work last Friday. He assumed that he would see her today and would ask what had happened, but her desk was empty and looked just as it did when he had left on Friday. Was she ill? Had she made it to Adolf's? He decided that he would ask Adolf, but he couldn't do that now, not in Adolf's present state. He wanted to ask him about speaking as well, but he wasn't sure that he could do that either. So many unanswered questions, but all that mattered right now was getting Adolf patched up and the doctor reporting that he would be okay. Until then, Mr. Becker would continue to pace, and the questions would keep racking up with each step. Finally, the office door opened, and the doctor stepped out looking exhausted. He wiped the sweat and blood from his forehead, throwing his jacket over his folded arm, which carried his medical bag. "He'll be fine," the doctor reported, "but those wounds are likely to scar." Mr. Becker felt a wave of relief at the news. "Thank you so much, doctor," he said, shaking the doctor's tired hand and showing him the way out. Mr. Becker returned to his office door, pausing to glance over again at Frida's vacant desk before entering. He closed his eyes and muttered to himself, one problem at a time, then took a deep breath, collected himself, and opened the door to his office. He entered the room with the confidence of a ship's captain. He would not let his sailors see that he was shaken at this incident or give away his concern at Frida's absence. He was the rock of the Steinberg piano factory. His charge was to bring order and solutions, especially in times of desperate chaos. He found Adolf lying in the middle of the floor. His face was covered in gauze that was striped with blood like a candy cane. He had his hands folded on his chest, a rolled-up jacket under his head as a makeshift pillow, and his legs were lying flat but limp. He looked dead. Mr. Becker stopped in his tracks, frozen at this scene. He focused his eyes on the gauze covering Adolf's mouth and nose, looking for an indication that he was breathing. For several seconds, the gauze did not move. Mr. Becker's brow furrowed as the concern mounted. Finally, Adolf let out a long exhale from his mouth, and the gauze that was covering it lifted like a parachute. Relief washed over Mr. Becker's entire body. He released his body's frozen state and stepped forward toward Adolf, kneeling down next to him. He placed a hand gently on Adolf's shoulder. "Adolf," Mr. Becker gently hailed. Adolf let out another big exhale from his mouth, but this breath turned into a rhythmic chest pulsing. He was crying. "I'm so sorry." Adolf repented through his crying breaths. He couldn't see Mr. Becker with the gauze covering his face, but he knew his voice. Mr. Becker shook his head. "Adolf, I told you, I'm not worried about the piano, I'm worried about you." Adolf cried harder. He wasn't apologizing for the piano this time. He was apologizing for what he had done to Frida. Thoughts raced through Mr. Becker's mind. Adolf was clearly in pain. He was speaking, not eloquently, but enough to be understood. Frida was missing. One problem at a time, he thought to himself again, and with that, he clasped Adolf's hand. "Let me take you home," Mr. Becker insisted as he pulled Adolf up to a sitting position, putting his other hand on Adolf's back to support him. "You can't walk back to your cottage in this state. My carriage will take us most of the way, and I'll be your eyes for the walk." Adolf's cry faded to a whimper. He resolved that he had no choice but to accept Mr. Becker's offer, so he had to pull himself together. He could let all of this poison emotion out in the solace of his cabin. Maintaining his composure for the journey home was going to take every ounce of strength he had left, and then some. He hadn't slept since his last encounter with his mother, late Friday night. He refused. He had only returned to work on Monday to forget about the hell he had found himself in, and because he thought it would make him less suspect in Frida's disappearance. This was the price of his fatigue, a face striped in guilt, a cursed scarlet letter, a mark of sin, and an uncomfortable journey with the man whose assistant had shown Adolf kindness, and he repaid her with unspeakable evil. Nightmare. The word escaped Adolf's open mouth before he could stop it. He wasn't yet used to having to filter his thoughts and divert them from his mouth. He had spoken more this day than he ever had in his entire life, and, particularly in his state of distress, he had very little control over anything. The words that escaped him sounded more animal than human. He hoped that Mr. Becker didn't understand this word. His face, still completely covered with gauze, was in shock at his potential fatal misstep. This one word could quickly implicate him in Frida's disappearance. Maybe more, maybe less, maybe nothing. He was worried at the unknown, and he couldn't read Mr. Becker's face to determine how worried he should be. Mr. Becker looked at Adolf's gauze-covered face, grinned slightly, gave a single muted chuckle, and pulled Adolf up to his feet. Adolf wasn't expecting this, and the thrust upward sent his stomach in the opposite direction. His body tensed as he came to his feet. Mr. Becker, seeing Adolf's tension, placed his hands on Adolf's shoulders. "It does seem like something that damned horse would do," he said, offering another single muted chuckle. Adolf tensed harder. How did Mr. Becker know about the white mare? The way home. Adolf and Mr. Becker sat shoulder to shoulder in the carriage. Adolf was still tense, silently panicking with curiosity while Mr. Becker navigated the gravel road in Heisenberg. That damned horse. Mr. Becker's words looped in Adolf's mind. How did he know? Had Adolf's mother appeared to him as well, or did he go through this himself? If he did, how did it end? What did he do? What does he know? What doesn't he know? A sudden clatter and the feeling of a short fall let Adolf know that they were outside of town now. The road turns from gravel to dirt around a kilometer down from the path to Adolf's home. Soon the ride would be over, and Adolf would be free from the awkward tension of being blindly pressed against his boss, who had just mentioned the mayor and whose assistant was now buried in the woods they were galloping toward. Mr. Becker had questions of his own to hold in. How was Adolf speaking? What happened today? Had he seen Frida? He kept quiet until they reached their stop and then realized that his work wasn't yet complete. Adolf's cabin was a full kilometer off the road. A footpath was the only option, and Adolf wouldn't be walking anywhere without assistance. "I'll come around to help you down and then we'll start the walk," Mr. Becker explained to Adolf, ensuring that Adolf wouldn't try to move on his own. He stepped down and walked toward his carriage horse, looking for something sturdy to secure the horse to. The walk would be long, far, and slow. Another wave of panic flooded Adolf's mind and body. He hadn't thought this far ahead. He hadn't realized that Mr. Becker would be walking him all the way to his cabin door. Even worse, inside? No, he can't see the piano. No, this cannot happen. Think of something. Adolf pleaded with his mind to solve the impossible. He was so distracted by the questions in his mind during the ride that he neglected to come up with a plan for what came after the ride. "All right then, hold out your hand," Mr. Becker instructed, ready to begin the next quiet, uneasy journey. Adolf held out his hand, and Mr. Becker clasped it with a firm brace, allowing Adolf to his feet. "Careful now," Mr. Becker instructed, as Adolf began stepping down from the carriage, clasping Adolf's other hand to provide an easier descent to the dirt, safely landing. Adolf tried to look around from behind the gauze still covering his face. The light slowly pulsed through the swaying, half-barren trees and shone with less obstruction above the path that led to Adolf's cabin. He knew where he was. He may be able to navigate the path on his own. "I'm fine," Adolf nervously pleaded. Mr. Becker looked at Adolf's gauze-covered face, then at the wooded path to the cabin with ultimate skepticism and confusion. "No, Adolf, I don't think you are, and I won't settle for anything less than seeing you safe and comfortable in your own bed," Mr. Becker rebutted. That was the response Adolf expected. He hung his head slightly, then quickly conceded with a nod. He knew it was a long shot, but it was the only idea he had come up with in the few minutes since he discovered that he needed one. He held out his arm for Mr. Becker to guide, and the two set off on the path. The sound of crunching leaves bounced from one tree to another with every step that Adolf and Mr. Becker took, camouflaging what would otherwise be deafening silence, except for the occasional "watch your step" from Mr. Becker. Their respective mysteries occupied their minds. They were each desperate to ask the other so many questions, but neither gave in. Adolf's obsessive curiosity with Mr. Becker's knowledge of the mayor fought for attention with the panic that accompanied the lack of a plan. He still hadn't figured out what he was going to do when they reached the cabin. He was powerless to prevent Mr. Becker from seeing the piano, so his mind raced with the possible outcomes. He would want to talk about it. He would have questions. Adolf had no answers yet, and at their current speed, he estimated that they had 30 minutes to come up with something. That would be plenty of time, so long as Mr. Becker didn't try to spark up a conversation. "Adolf," Mr. Becker hailed. "Damn," Adolf thought. "Watch your head here. There's a low branch just ahead." Mr. Becker placed a hand on his shoulder to help him avoid the obstacle. Relief washed over Adolf. He was free to think, running through the infinite potential explanations for the piano and anticipating Mr. Becker's reaction to each. As they drew close to the cabin, Adolf had settled on a path, the truth, part of it at least. 10 steps till the door now. I'll get you inside and settled. You'll need to rest. I'm sure you're exhausted. I'll ask the doctor to visit you tomorrow and freshen those bandages. Agreed?" Mr. Becker was better at planning his words than Adolf. He had developed this plan in the few seconds before opening his mouth. Adolf wasn't surprised by this. Mr. Becker was always a strong leader. Adolf nodded in agreement and reached for the key in his pocket, deciding to hand it to Mr. Becker rather than try to fumble through unlocking the door himself. Mr. Becker would be entering the cabin and seeing the piano no matter what Adolf did. and he saw no sense in fighting the inevitable. Mr. Becker lifted the key from Adolf's open palm and, keeping one hand on Adolf's arm to support him, used the other hand to insert the key into the lock, twist it, and gently push the door in. The rays of the late afternoon sun slowly illuminated Adolf's cabin as the door slowly opened. A thick blanket of shadow peeled away from right to left as Adolf's piano was painted with a wave of light. The tiny curves of its hand-carved surface created hundreds of reflection points. As the light fully revealed the piano, it glistened in glory. It was striking and magnificently unique, not by the standards of society's style, but by the judgment of the universe. Mr. Becker felt as if he had just unsuspectingly stumbled upon a hidden treasure that was seeing light for the first time in 1,000 years. He was frozen and dumbfounded. He was breathless, silent. His hand fell slowly from Adolf's arm as his entire body was overridden by sheer awe. Adolf broke the frozen time after a solid minute of silence by taking a step forward toward the door. Mr. Becker realized that his hand had fallen and that he was failing to do his job, guiding Adolf, and quickly returned to his post. "Here we are," Mr. Becker said as he established support on Adolf's arm, his voice cracking slightly from the dryness of an open mouth, his eyelids forcibly blinking to replenish his eyeballs from the same dryness. Something about true beauty steals more from the body than attention. There's a cost to gaze upon it. Mr. Becker thought about this as he guided Adolf into the cabin, glancing to the piano to maneuver around it, but mostly to admire the new angle that each step brought. "Adolf, this is incredible," Mr. Becker finally released, nearly giggling with childlike excitement, looking from the enrapturing piano to the blood-striped gauze-covered Adolf and realizing that he had once again abandoned his post as guide. "I'm so sorry, Adolf. Let's get you seated," Mr. Becker said with shame, scanning the room for a chair. He saw a single chair near the piano and reached for it, but he quickly realized that this was the only piece of furniture Adolf possessed. There was no bed, no table, just this chair, a pile of tools, and a piano that nearly filled the entire cabin by itself. While continuing to scan the room, he slid the chair behind Adolf's legs and slowly started guiding him downward into it. Adolf let out a deep exhale as he lowered to the seat, exhausted from the calamity of the day, but ready to blindly face the next challenge, Mr. Becker's questions about the piano. Seated, he placed his hands on his knees and patiently awaited Mr. Becker's next move. He was finally too tired to panic. Mr. Becker's concern at the lack of amenities momentarily won over the piano for his attention. "Where do you sleep, Adolf?" Mr. Becker continued scanning for a bed, a cot, or a cushion. Adolf slowly pointed to the ground underneath the piano, directing Mr. Becker's eyes to a wadded-up canvas, Adolf's makeshift pillow, at the end of a large spot with less dust than the rest of the floor. That was Adolf's bed. Mr. Becker stared at the spot for a full minute, trying to imagine sleeping there on the floor, underneath a piano, and remembering how fortunate he had been in his life to not be faced with such conditions. His eyes then traveled upward to the piano, and he realized why Adolf had no furniture. He had traded every piece of furniture, save that single chair, because of his passion. Pure obsession had fueled his craftsmanship with this piano. The bed didn't matter, the table didn't matter. Crafting this magnificent work of art trumped all of it. That Mr. Becker understood completely. "I must say, Adolf, if I were building this, I'd sleep there too." Mr. Becker smiled with admiration for Adolf's passion and dedication. Adolf tilted his head, surprised at Mr. Becker's words at first, then remembering that he too was a craftsman and lover of pianos. Mr. Becker had built pianos in the station next to Adolf for many years, and he had a real talent for the craft. Seeing Adolf's piano must have brought back an urge to build again. The builder in him likely saw it as a challenge that he wanted to accept, but his role as the boss prevented him from having that kind of fun now. He was envious of Adolf's work on this piano, and that was a sign of respect between builders. Adolf gave a slight chuckle and nodded in understanding. "Would you like me to help you to your bed?" Mr. Becker offered with a hint of a joking tone. Adolf held up his hand to signal a stop and shook his head no. "I see," Mr. Becker accepted. "I trust you'll be able to find your way all right." Adolf nodded yes. "All right then, I best be off." Mr. Becker didn't want to leave. He wanted to inspect every inch of Adolf's piano. He wanted to explore and admire the craftsmanship slowly. This didn't seem like the time for that, but the urge to ask for permission nearly won over his manners. Nearly, but not quite. Mr. Becker stepped toward the still open door, stopping at the threshold. "The doctor will be by in the morning to freshen those bandages. Get some rest, Adolf." Adolf nodded and raised his hand to signal goodbye. Mr. Becker tipped his hat and stepped out of the cabin, pulling the door shut behind him. Covering Adolf and his piano in the blanket of shadow they had peeled away just minutes ago. Adolf remained still and silent as he listened to Mr. Becker's footsteps in the leaves become more distant. Once they faded completely, he released everything that he had been holding in for the past several hours. His body went limp. He slumped forward, burying his face in his hands to weep only to realize that he couldn't. His face had been marred by his carelessness, his exhaustion, and his sins. The striped cuts running across his face hurt to touch, so he wept into his gauze, placing his hands on the top of his head, his elbows on his knees, rocking back and forth on waves of emotion that crashed against him, one after another after another. He hadn't slept in 40 hours. He was already exhausted, and releasing all of this emotion sent him over the edge. He couldn't fight sleep any longer. He had no choice but to blindly navigate on his hands and knees to the spot under the floor underneath his piano and succumb to the overpowering gravity of sleep. He laid his head on the wadded-up canvas, curled his knees into his chest, and folded his arms, using his body as a kind of blanket. By this point, the gauze covering his face was soaked with tears. He slowly peeled it away from his skin, revealing the horizontal striped cuts from his hairline to the bottom of his chin. Thin lines stacked the length of his face, but his nose appeared to have received the most damage and deepest cuts. It was red and swollen, while the rest of the cuts appeared to be clean, shallow stripes. Without the gauze, the cool air rushed to his raw skin, accented by the remaining residue from his tears. It was equally refreshing and painful. He winced and then opened one eye slowly, testing to see how painful it would be before opening both to the cool air. The first thing he saw was the tear-soaked, blood-crusted gauze in his hands. He opened his other eye to bring it into focus. He was too tired to be upset at the sight, but he knew that he didn't want to see it the next time he opened his eyes. So he weakly discarded the gauze over his shoulder, returned his arms to their folded human blanket position, and closed his eyes. Sleep's gravity instantly took hold and hurtled him through the atmosphere, crashing through the surface of the conscious world and breaking through to the unconscious realm. The return. A high-pitched, piercing squeal startled Adolf's eyes open. Total darkness. He was lying on the ground in the same position he had fallen asleep in. His face was pressed against the cold ground that could not be seen but could be felt. He knew where he was. He had been avoiding this place for over 40 hours, and he knew that his absence would not go unpunished. Another high-pitched squeal, this one much louder, angrier, roar-like. It echoed in every direction. Adolf slowly sat upright. Deep down, he was afraid, but he had run out of the surface fear that required energy to express. He was defeated, thinking, what could possibly be worse than what I've already been through? He turned his head to the right, half-heartedly watching for the angry white mare. Nothing. He turned to the left. Nothing. He swung his hands upward, sending the message, well, let's get on with it, with his entire demeanor. He was broken, not into moral submission, but into the acceptance that no good was coming for him. Everything was wrong now. Everything was evil. He was in hell, in both the conscious and unconscious worlds. He unhurriedly climbed to his feet, waiting for the pain to reveal itself, but not giving it the satisfaction of seeing him in anguish. He was visibly numb. He waited. The total darkness was now accompanied by total silence. This tension was intentional. The mare was punishing him, and it was determined to show him that it was worthy of his anguish. He had every reason to be afraid, and yet he was numb to the mare's siren. Letting him wait was the mare's way of taking this psychological warfare to the next level, determined to strike fear into Adolf's shattered soul. He waited. It had been too long, uncomfortably long. He began to wonder if the mare, his mother, or whatever was controlling this place had decided to leave him here, to spend eternity in this purgatory of absolute deprivation. He was numb, but eternity and nothing did scare him. The longer he waited, the more it scared him. He felt as if he had already gone mad, but the kind of mad he would encounter if trapped here was worse than anything he had imagined. This, he thought, This is worse than what I've already been through. He became visibly afraid. The mare had won. He heard a whoosh and simultaneously felt a burst of air on the back of his neck. It was warm, but it made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end as if it was ice cold. Another whoosh of warmth. He knew that the mare was right behind him, mere inches away. He didn't want it to be real, but a snort made it undeniable, and he slowly began turning toward the mare. The instant his eyes finally connected with the mare's face, it released a booming roar, striking fear into every bone in Adolf's body, every fiber of his being, and it continued roaring until Adolf was knocked back down to the ground, driven by a combination of force and fear. The fear had made him weak, but it was the inability of his ears to handle the deafening volume of the roar that had knocked him down. The pressure had instantly made him lose balance. To hear something so loud that it disabled his body's ability to balance was truly terrifying. He held up a hand to shield himself from the mare. It was a futile reflex. His other hand tended to his ears, scrambling to stop the ringing and release the pressure. He looked past his hand to the mare, but it was gone. Confused, frightened, and dazed, he searched for a sign of the mare in any direction. Nothing. But the mare had toyed with him, making him wait for several minutes before striking. It could easily happen again. He continued searching for the white terror, moving from his fallen, half-laying, half-seated position to his knees. His eyes darted from one direction to the other. His breath quickened. Adolf had discovered that the thing he feared most was this nothing. The nothing of being trapped for eternity in total darkness and silence. The nothing of the mare toying with him by making him wait. Nothing was horrifying. He staggered to his feet, continuing the frantic search. Still dizzy, the rapid and random turning from his search made him feel like the entire void was spinning around him, and nausea now added to his growing list of critical malfunctions. This was now a true meltdown. He fell back to his knees, stretching out his wobbly arms and sobbing in frustrated defeat. "Adolf, this is unavoidable," Adolf's mother said sternly from behind him. Her body language judged Adolf for his present state, for his insubordination, and for his stubbornness. Adolf's sobs ceased. Her voice triggered the memory of the last time they spoke, of the evil she had ordered of him, of his suspicions that someone or something was controlling her, or worse, that it may not be his mother after all. He wasn't sure what to do or say. He remained on his knees, mouth dropped open, arms slowly lowering from their outstretched state, his eyes looking in the direction of his mother, but his head and body remaining stationary. Like feeling the mare breathing on his neck, he didn't want to turn around, because that made it real. "Did you think you could just never sleep again?" she scolded, taking a step, then another, walking in orbit toward Adolf's front-facing view. He wouldn't need to turn around. She was coming to him, and Mother was not happy. Adolf's eyes first caught her boot stepping into his peripheral, and they followed as she walked forward toward his direct line of sight, scanning every detail about her appearance upward as she stepped deliberately. That's when he saw the cloak that he had noticed the first time he encountered her in this place, the cloak that he had found odd because he had never seen it before, yet everything else about her appearance was exactly how he remembered it. Did the cloak mean something? It wasn't particularly noteworthy in appearance. It was plain-looking, black with an unrecognizable black pattern that was barely visible. She stopped when she reached his direct attention, and with her arms folded, turned, looked down at Adolf with disgust, and ordered him to stand with just the direction of her hand's signal. Adolf wouldn't look her in the eyes. He was staring straight ahead, but not at her, more so through her, distant and detached. Her disgust turned to anger, and she slowly leaned forward to put her eyes level with his. She unfolded her arms, planting her hands on her knees as she lowered her upper body. She stared directly into his soul. He was still distant, looking at her eyes but not into them. This angered her more. "Get up," she commanded with deliberate articulation. She pursed her lips in frustration. Adolf was a tearful, snotty mess. The mare had tortured him to bring his fear to the foreground, and now he feared that this was merely intermission. Finally, he looked into his mother's eyes. She was now as close to him as the mare had been when it breathed on his neck. He searched her eyes for a sign. Was this really her or something different? If this was her, what was controlling her? This was not the woman he remembered. He examined each eye, seeking a message, a glimmer of hope, something to explain her complicit role in all of this. Her right eye was just as he remembered it, hazel green on the outside fading to chestnut brown at the pupil. Her left eye was the same color, but it had strange markings in the iris, almost as if layers of the iris had been eaten away in several spots. It wasn't right. He had looked into his mother's eyes thousands of times. This wasn't her. He looked away from her to the ground, still on his knees, his head now hung low, not in shame, but in realization that the person or thing he had been seeing all this time, that he had trusted, that he had embraced, was not his mother, and the hell he now lived in had dealt yet another blow to his fragile mind. His reality was a farce. He thought back to the events that led to this moment and questioned their reality. Had he built the piano? Was Frida really gone? Did he speak? He couldn't know, but the pain that he felt was real. The grief for Frida was real. This place, this chamber of nothing, maybe it wasn't. If this wasn't really his mother, what else was merely a charade? The mayor? His mission? What would happen if he simply refused? His mother, or whoever had assumed her form, threatened that if he refused, he would spend the rest of his days breaking rocks in prison. Was that real? He slowly looked up at her with these thoughts racing through his mind. As much as he tried to hide it, the rebellion brewed in his eyes. She noticed it immediately, surprised and slightly disarmed, vulnerable. She stood upright, tilted her head, and placed her hand on her chest, unable to disguise her momentary surprise. Realizing this, she had to quickly counter. She could have composed herself, put on her most proud and authoritative face, and asserted herself over him, but she saw a coup d'etat in his eyes. This was no longer a battle of authority. She needed to change her strategy and begin the battle of emotion. She segued her surprise into panicked paranoia. She began to look around frantically as if they were being watched by someone who could not be seen in the void. Her eyes darted with fear. Her breath quickened. She slowly leaned forward and brought her hand from her chest to beside her mouth in preparation to deliver a whisper. She needed to shield the sound and sight of her words from whomever or whatever was out there. Without looking at him but continuing to search with her eyes, she whispered with short breaths, "Adolf, please, he'll destroy us both. You have to do this. If not for you." She now looked him squarely in the eyes with intense deliberation, delivering the rest of her words from her eyes into his. "For me." She held this gaze and released a single tear. Adolf was shaken. Her fear was unexpected. He had thought after their last encounter that maybe she was under the control of someone or something else. This confirmed it. But what about the eye, the cloak? Could those be the results of her being controlled? What had she already endured? This was her, but something else was controlling her, forcing her to play this role, to convince her own son to kill. Why? What does it want? How would it destroy them? His eyes watered with empathy for her. "Destroy?" he whispered back, looking back into her eyes and reinforcing the gravity of his questions. "Our souls, Adolf. He feeds on their energy." She spoke quickly, eyes now darting around again. She quickly stood upright, snapped her composure into place, returned her eyes to his, and announced with authority, "You must take 12 more souls. There is no choice. You cannot run from this." Her body and face may have conveyed authority, but her eyes conveyed the hidden meaning. She needed him. They were both in danger. Adolf took time to let her words sink into his bones. His mind was now delivering the news to his heart that he must kill again, and not just once, but 12 more times. There was no choice. As his heart received this news, it forced a flood of tears to his eyes. His face contorted in sorrow. He curled forward into his hands and sobbed. He had been sentenced to death, but not his death. His mother looked upon him with her stern facade, but still caring eyes. "Will you oblige?" she curtly asked. Adolf continued sobbing. "You must say it, Adolf," she pleaded. "Yes!" he yelled at her, then began turning in every direction and yelling for whoever was out there to hear. "I'll do it!" The words pained his heart, which sent another wave of sobbing out of him. A tear formed in his mother's eye. She swallowed her sorrow for him, blinked the pending tear away, and nodded to confirm. The blinding curtain that signaled his departure from the void quickly washed over. Adolf didn't open his eyes, but he could feel the light enveloping him. Knock, 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 knock. Adolf was pulled out of his slumber by rapping at his door. The sun penetrated his cabin and forced him to squint. The rapping continued. Adolf? Mr. Becker called. I'm here with the doctor, he announced. Adolf's eyes opened fully with fear. His heart pounded. The situation he had just been plucked from was still heavy on his chest. He gasped, feeling as if he had been drowning in darkness. He quickly moved to sit up, forgetting that he was underneath his piano. Bam! The top of his head collided with the bottom of the piano's body and sent a burst of pain down his skull, accompanied by a ringing sound that grew louder as the pain grew. He opened his mouth with a silent scream, moving a hand to his head to inspect the damage. Knock, knock, knock. Adolf! Adolf! Are you okay? Mr. Becker had heard the collision and was growingly concerned. Adolf used his elbows to crawl forward out from under the piano, inspected the top of his head once more for blood, and then pushed himself to his feet. He had just discovered that his mother was in danger, agreed to take 12 more souls to save them both, cracked his head on the piano, and now he needed to open the door and act like everything was normal and fine. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. While doing this, he realized that his gauze was still on the floor underneath the piano. He looked at it and decided that it would be too much work to scramble back for it now. It was too late. There was no going back now. He stepped forward to the door, twisted the handle, and pulled it in toward him. Mr. Becker's ear had been up to the door, so he fell slightly forward when Adolf swung the door open. He caught himself and looked to Adolf. You could tell by Mr. Becker's reaction that Adolf looked like he had been through hell. Ah, there you are, Mr. Becker said in a much softer, more delicate voice. The doctor scurried himself in, setting his bag down on the floor and scanning the room to audit what tools he might have at his disposal. His eyes couldn't help but catch the piano at first. After all, the only two things to see were the piano and a chair. My word, the doctor raised an eyebrow, impressed. That certainly is a beauty. The doctor turned toward Mr. Becker, who nodded in an "I told you so" manner. The doctor then noticed the chair. Just have a seat here, Adolf. The doctor's tone had changed. He was now in treatment mode. Adolf sauntered to the chair and lowered himself into it. The doctor examined his injuries closely, placing his hand on the top of Adolf's head to control his movement. Adolf winced. It was impossible to hide the pain of his collision with the piano. The doctor reacted by examining the area. Yes, I see you've earned yourself another goose egg there. Hit your head on the piano, didn't you? The doctor motioned to the wadded-up canvas underneath the piano, a clear sign of a sleeping spot, and he smiled. Adolf nodded. You'll be all right. I'll clean these wounds again, and we'll get some fresh gauze on them. I brought more supplies, so we won't have to cover your entire face this time. The doctor reached into his bag and grabbed a handful of supplies. Mr. Becker stepped forward from the doorway and removed his hat as the doctor focused on his work. Did you sleep well, Adolf? Mr. Becker inquired, seeking to quickly fill the quota of small talk so he could move on to a much bigger subject. Adolf shrugged and tilted his head, accepting that yes would have been a bit difficult to believe given his present state. Try not to move, the doctor directed curtly. My fault, doctor, Mr. Becker admitted. He began pacing through the room, looking more closely at the piano and trying to give the doctor room to work. I had an idea after leaving you yesterday, Adolf. Mr. Becker was still looking at the piano. Now, I won't ask you any questions, so you don't have to move. All I ask is that you think about what I'm about to offer. Now Mr. Becker stopped pacing and looked him squarely in the eyes, seeking to punctuate the weight of his words. He wanted Adolf to know that he meant business. Adolf blinked to show that he understood. Mr. Becker resumed his pacing and gazed at the piano, anxiously tapping his hat in his hands. After I left you yesterday, I couldn't stop thinking about your piano. Mr. Becker seemed ashamed at this. Of course, I was worried about your condition, but the piano has fought every unrelated thought for attention. It has haunted me, Mr. Becker explained with utmost sincerity. The doctor continued cleaning Adolf's wounds. Adolf held still and kept his eyes on Mr. Becker as he listened. I think I know why, Mr. Becker continued. This piano wants to be seen. It deserves to be seen, and you deserve recognition for what you've created here. Adolf didn't react, but he didn't feel the same as Mr. Becker. The piano was his curse, and he wanted nothing more than to be freed from it. If it weren't for his mother's soul being at stake, he would set it on fire this instant. Every year, a group of the industry's top authorities tours the factory. It's a chance for us to show off new models and features, and it's critically important because these people shape the industry's demand. They'll be here Friday. Mr. Becker now turned back to Adolf and locked his eyes with him again to deliver the ask. I want to show them this piano, Adolf. I want you to build more of them, and I want to partner with you on all orders for this piano moving forward. You're about to become a very wealthy man. Mr. Becker said with the same tone of sincerity but added a grin. He then resumed his pacing but began looking at the cabin instead of the piano. Of course, to get the piano out of your cabin, we'll have to take out this wall, he explained nonchalantly as he motioned to the side of Adolf's cabin. But after this, you'll be able to buy any house in town, or build a much larger cabin right here. The doctor was now applying fresh bandages to Adolf's face. He remained still. He didn't know what to think. None of this really mattered. He was trapped in a living hell. Any glimmer of hope or good was probably just a trick, or would somehow turn into another chapter in his nightmare. Nightmare, Adolf thought, remembering that he had been so curious to ask Mr. Becker what he knew about the white mare. The doctor was working on his forehead. If he was going to speak, now would be the time. Adolf cleared his throat. Nightmare, he squeaked out, his voice dry and raspy. Mr. Becker stopped and turned toward Adolf, confused. The doctor stopped and looked at Adolf as well. Both were perplexed by his response to Mr. Becker's offer. What do you know about white mare? Adolf spoke with great care to avoid confusion. Mr. Becker and the doctor looked at each other. The doctor went back to applying fresh gauze, finishing up the last pieces. Mr. Becker looked back to Adolf. The white mare? He sought clarification, but then he remembered what Adolf had said in his office. Nightmare, and that he had responded with something about the horse. Ah, the nightmare, Mr. Becker clarified to himself, looking to the ground, then back up to Adolf. Haven't you heard the tales of the Alp? Mr. Becker's face showed surprise. Adolf shook his head as the doctor stepped away after completing his work, leaving Adolf's face gauze-covered once again, but with his eyes and mouth exposed this time. Mr. Becker glanced to the doctor and then back to Adolf. It's a common tale that I first heard as a young boy, a bit dark for children to hear, but I believe it's still commonly told. Mr. Becker took on the tone of a storyteller now. The Alp is an elf-like creature, but it is, among many things, a shapeshifter, and the white mare is its most common form. Adolf tensed as he absorbed the words. He had never heard any of these tales. The Alp uses trickery to convince you to do things, bad things. I believe that they were all just imaginative lessons used to make children behave or try to explain away bad dreams. The white mare form of the Alp is where the term nightmare comes from, Mr. Becker summarized. Several seconds of silence fell on the room as Adolf looked to the ground and tried to process this information. The white mare wasn't lore to him. The Alp had his mother and was using her soul to force him to kill. This was beyond a children's story. It was a very real nightmare, and he was living it. Breaking the silence and stillness, the doctor picked up his bag and looked to Mr. Becker, signaling to him that he was finished and ready to leave. Mr. Becker looked to him and nodded, and then looked to Adolf. Think about my offer, Adolf. We'll return tomorrow to check on you, and we can discuss your piano further if you're ready. Adolf quickly looked from the ground up to Mr. Becker, who was now stepping toward the door, raising his hat to place it on his head. How many people? Adolf asked. Mr. Becker stopped in his tracks with his hat halfway to his head and looked back to Adolf, glancing to the side as he tried to determine what Adolf was asking about. The group that will be visiting on Friday? Mr. Becker asked. Adolf nodded. Mr. Becker finished placing his hat on his head and glanced to the floor while he counted, then looked up to Adolf. 10, he answered. Thinking he had satisfied Adolf's questions and wanting to give him time to think about his offer, he started to step toward the door again. Yes. Adolf interrupted his departure again, and again Mr. Becker stopped dead in his tracks, looking over his shoulder back to Adolf, who was still seated and gauze-covered. Next to his glorious piano, he looked like a mad mummy. Genius presents itself in strange ways, thought Mr. Becker. Adolf pushed himself up to his feet, straightened his posture, and addressed Mr. Becker once again. I'll do it, Adolf affirmed, confident in his words. A slow smile crept over Mr. Becker's face. Excellent, Mr. Becker replied, nodding to Adolf in agreement. We can discuss details tomorrow," he added, stepping out the door and being bathed in sunlight before turning back to Adolf one more time before departing. "Just one more thing." Mr. Becker was now a backlit silhouette. "Did Frida happen to visit you last Friday?" Adolf's heart sank. He did his best not to let his eyes communicate his guilt and shook his head slightly. Mr. Becker gave a single disappointed nod, and with that, he turned away, and with the doctor at his side, started the long walk back to the road where his carriage was waiting. Adolf stepped to his door and watched as they walked away. His mother had told him that an opportunity would arise and that he had to oblige to save her soul. This group of people would satisfy 10 of the 12 remaining souls he had to take, 13 in total. He accepted in his core that he would do it. He would follow through. He would murder 10 people at once for his mother. He slowly closed the door on who he once was and began a new journey as a bringer of death and harvester of souls. As Adolf closed the door on any good left in him, a flame in his eyes was snuffed out. He felt a cold darkness win the battle. He was merely an instrument now, ready to play his part in the piracy of 10 more souls. His only remaining bother was that he still wouldn't be done after the group of 10 coming to Steinberg on Friday. He needed 2 more. If only there were 12, it would at least be over. To what end? He didn't know, but that didn't stop him from wanting it to be over. Mr. Becker said 10, but surely he would be there as well. Yesterday, Adolf would have been bothered by the thought of making Mr. Becker one of his victims, but today, he's saving his mother, and he's doing it by not caring anymore. If there is such a thing as a humanity switch, he had flipped his. Surely, Mr. Becker would be there. 11. He stood there in front of his closed door, staring into nothing, thinking. If Adolf was to have his piano set up and perform for the group, he would need help. Otto, his assistant at Steinberg, would likely be assigned to him for the day. That would be 12. Yes, that would do it. He would need to confirm that Mr. Becker would be there and arrange for Otto to be assigned to help him that day. 12 souls at one time. Adolf was satisfied with his plan and let his mind move to the next worry, the Alp. He looked around his cabin, unsure where to place himself. The chair? No, he had been stuck there far too long already. The piano bench? No. He didn't want to look at his piano until he absolutely had to. His cabin now felt like a prison cell, and for perhaps the first time in his life, he was desperate to get out. He looked out the window to the infinite wood. The light pulsed as the wind gently swayed the still half-barren trees. Single leaves fell in slow motion from above. Yes, a walk through the woods would be just the thing to accompany his meditation. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, looking up toward the sun, desperate to feel its warmth followed by the cool breeze on his face, but he couldn't. The gauze stole those from him. He was annoyed at the inconvenience, but quickly realized he only had himself to blame, or the Alp. He needed to think. He didn't have time for self-pity or to be annoyed by trivial things. He tugged his jacket tight, folding his arms and tucking his hands under them to keep them warm. And he set off on an aimless journey through the woods. His only destination was clarity. As he stepped through the crunching leaves, the beautiful scene around him faded away, overshadowed by the puzzle at hand, the Alp. It had his mother and was holding her soul hostage. The mare that had tortured him was one of the Alp's forms. What other forms had it assumed? What was its natural form? How long had it been torturing people in their slumber? And how many people had it imposed its will upon? How many souls had it fed on already? His mind raced through questions, each with no easy answer, no resource to reference, no one to ask more than a vague question of. Mr. Becker had been told stories as a young boy. Who else knew these stories? That was the end of the line for Adolf's train of thought. It didn't matter who else knew the stories about the Alp, because Adolf didn't speak to anyone. He didn't have friends. He had no one to confide in, nowhere to turn. Now that he was a killer, that was unlikely to change. He halted, frozen. He had been walking aimlessly, letting his mind and his steps wander, and they had both led him straight to Frida's grave. A lump formed in his chest and began to work its way up his throat. Perhaps it was the old Adolf crying for help, desperate to intervene in the pending plot to take a dozen souls. He knew that lump climbing up his throat was all of the feelings he had swallowed just hours ago. Grief, sadness, regret, fear, loneliness, compassion, kindness, moral goodness. He couldn't let them spill out. He couldn't regress now. He had to save his mother. He recognized that his own soul was beyond saving now. He was damned for eternity, but his mother, he could save her, but only if he swallowed this lump once more. Only if he held down anything that might prevent him from accomplishing this mission. He had to be a monster. With his eyes still fixed on Frida's leaf-covered, unmarked grave, he swallowed the lump, sending old Adolf back down again. He set off in a new direction, away from Frida's grave, away from himself. The production floor at Steinberg was bustling like a well-oiled machine. Every corner of the factory was in motion, even Adolf's station. Otto was repairing the piano damaged in Adolf's incident the day before. He was leaning into the main cavity of the piano, inspecting the section of strings that Adolf's face had been pressed into. The strings were stained with blood, and one spot even had bits of skin left behind. Otto grimaced at this sight and wondered what to do with the strings. He saw Mr. Becker striding through the production floor briskly, clearly on a mission. "Mr. Becker, sir!" Otto raised his hand to catch Mr. Becker's attention as he flew by. Mr. Becker was moving so quickly that he barely saw Otto hail him. He was on his way to his office, where he needed to plan the extraction and travel of Adolf's piano from his cabin to Steinberg. This had better be important, he thought. "Yes, Otto." Mr. Becker reluctantly offered his attention. Otto motioned to the crime scene inside the piano. "The strings aren't broken, but..." Otto grimaced again at the sight. Mr. Becker looked inside the piano, examining the strings without giving away a facial reaction. After a few seconds, he stood tall and looked to Otto. "Replace the strings and anything else you find soiled," he said firmly. Otto nodded and turned around to grab supplies. Mr. Becker returned to his previously charted course, walking purposefully toward his office. While walking through the production floor, he looked around at the men, building a list of who he would recruit for a transport team. It would be a challenging journey. He needed strong men who could also take great care of precious cargo. He exited the production floor and walked into the office area, looking up to see Frida, turned around at her desk, examining something. He froze, overtaken by surprise. There was no hiding the puzzling thoughts racing through his mind, but they quickly faded. It didn't matter what had happened. She was here. "I thought we were going to have to form a search party," Mr. Becker announced to Frida in a half-joking, half-relieved tone. She sat straight, looking over her shoulder in his direction, then turned her chair toward him. It wasn't Frida. It was her sister, Agnes. She bore a striking resemblance to Frida. Her hair and build were identical, which is why Mr. Becker had mistaken her for Frida. Aside from her nose, they could be twins. Agnes was 2 years older than Frida, and ever since their parents had passed 13 years ago, Agnes had taken on a mother role to Frida. Mr. Becker hadn't seen Agnes since last year's Erster Feiertag celebration at Steinberg, and that was typically the one time per year he would see her. Her eyes were swollen and red. She had clearly been crying, and she was visibly still upset. She held a handkerchief in her hand. Her bottom lip quivered. Her brow and eyes conveyed fear and doubt, but the rest of her demeanor held firm. A woman on a mission. Mr. Becker's heart sank. Something terrible must have happened to Frida. "Agnes?" His tone revealed his sunken heart. "What's happened? Where's Frida?" His face grew more concerned, and he approached Agnes to comfort her. She sobbed, turning her chair toward Mr. Becker as he walked beside the desk toward her, and looked up at him with glistening, puffy eyes. "I had hoped you would be able to tell me," she whispered through her tears, bringing her handkerchief to her eyes, then nose. Mr. Becker's face shifted to pure confusion. He sat on the corner of Frida's desk next to Agnes, perplexed. "I haven't seen her since last Friday," he confessed. "She went back to check on one of our builders who had missed work, and I assumed that she had gone home after." "Back?" Agnes inquired. "To see Adolf?" Mr. Becker nodded. Agnes looked down at the soiled handkerchief, fidgeting nervously as she recounted her last memories with her sister. She told me she had visited his cabin on Thursday and left a note. She was terribly concerned about him, Agnes recounted. We all were, Mr. Becker added. It turns out that he had a minor illness. He came back to work on Monday. Agnes perked up, eager to chase down this lead. Is he here now? She asked eagerly. Mr. Becker shook his head, but his eyes revealed that there was more to the story. When he came back on Monday, he had a terrible accident, marring his face. He's been home since then. I visited him just a few hours ago, and he's on the mend, Mr. Becker explained. Agnes began planning the journey to Adolph's in her mind, looking away from Mr. Becker and placing a hand to her chin, then looking back to him. Moving her hand from her chin to the arm of Frida's chair and pushing her back straight. Where is Adolph's cabin? Her eyes were determined now. Mr. Becker looked down with a jutted chin. I asked him if he had seen Frida last Friday. He delivered the words, still looking down, then raised his eyes to deliver the next words directly to her soul. He said she never came. Both of their heads dropped with a disappointed exhale. Agnes then remembered how Frida had spoken about Adolph over the years, not often, but enough for Agnes to be certain that Frida had said that Adolph does not speak. How did he say she never came when he does not speak? She looked to Mr. Becker's face, eager for an answer. Mr. Becker inhaled, raising his eyebrows and trying to find a way to deliver his response in a way that didn't make him seem crazy. He exhaled, lowering his brows to their default state as he realized there was no way to explain it other than just stating it plainly. He speaks now. He raised a single brow. Barely, but enough to answer my questions, he added, jutting his chin again to convey that this path is a dead end, and he's sorry for it. Agnes looked down and fidgeted with her handkerchief again for a few seconds, then looked back to Mr. Becker and reset her composure. I would still very much like to visit with him. Mr. Becker was fazed. His eyes widened slightly. Where is Adolph's cabin? She asked once more. Mr. Becker remained fazed for a long second, then stood up quickly and began walking back to the front side of the desk, stopping after 3 steps and looking over his shoulder toward Agnes. Come on, he lifted his chin. I'll take you to see him. A slow, almost smile formed on Agnes's face. She was surprised and thankful. She hadn't seen Frida since Friday morning, and she hadn't slept since then, speaking to anyone who may have seen her outside of Steinberg. This was the first glimmer of hope she had uncovered in her search, and Mr. Becker was the valiant knight going above and beyond for her, for Frida. This gesture solidified her understanding of the relationship and respect between Mr. Becker and Frida. He loved her in a way, not romantically, but as a father figure. He cared for her, and he, too, had been worried. She pushed herself out of Frida's chair and walked in step with him out of the office area, embarking on the journey to Adolph's cabin. On the carriage ride through and out of Heisenberg on the way to Adolph's cabin, Mr. Becker told Agnes everything he knew. He told her about Adolph's accident, how he had spoken, his piano, and the plan to showcase his piano on Friday. Agnes absorbed the information, asking follow-up questions for more details. By the time they reached the footpath to Adolph's cabin, Agnes had learned enough to believe that this would be a dead end. But she knew that Frida had visited his cabin on Thursday, if not also Friday, and she wanted to retrace her sister's footsteps. They were close, in sync. She thought seeing what Frida had seen might give her a clue, or maybe even lead her directly to Frida. Maybe she had fallen and was trapped somewhere. Maybe she was attacked. Wolves had been known to approach unsuspecting stragglers in these woods, but it had been years since she had heard of that. She didn't need to know what had happened. She just needed to find Frida. They walked slowly down the path, scanning for any sign of Frida. Adolph had been roaming the woods for hours. He had found the clarity he needed. He was now numb. His mind did not wander. His heart did not ache. His feet did not strain from the long walk. His face did not hurt. He did not feel anything. He trudged through the woods until his cabin appeared ahead. He planned to see his mother, to report to her that she would soon be safe. Soon, free? He was going to have all the souls that her captor required in 3 days' time. If he was to build up the strength this would require, he would need sleep, real sleep, Perhaps his plan would satisfy his mother or her captor, the Alp, if the stories were true, to allow him a night of real sleep. As he approached his cabin from behind, his eyes caught a glimpse of motion ahead. He focused on the area. It was the head of the path to the road, and two people were walking out of it, a man and a woman in a vivid blue coat. Adolf froze and evaluated his options. He could hide and wait them out. He had done it before. He couldn't run. If he could see them, they would soon see him, and the sound of the leaves would give his steps away. He leaned to the side and shielded his eyes to get a better look. It was Mr. Becker. Relief began to wash over Adolf's body until he got a better look at the woman. "Frida?" he gasped, his eyes shooting wide open as his body tensed. His heart raced. How was this possible? How? He had no plan for this. He had disabled all feelings, but panic would not be refused. Panic was immune to control. Mr. Becker and Frida were approaching Adolf's cabin, and Adolf had to do something. He was supposed to be resting. He was supposed to be home. He had to answer, but how could he? How could he face Frida? How was she here? How could he not face her? How could he not see her up close, see that this is real? The choice became clear, and his panic transitioned into action. He looked toward the back door of his cabin, then to Mr. Becker and Frida, who had not yet seen him, then back to the door. He took giant, slow, quiet steps toward his door, careful to avoid the leaves, racing against them as they approached the front door. He arrived first, but he still had to get inside. He gently placed 2 fingers on the latch. Knock, knock, knock. He used the sound of Mr. Becker's knock to disguise the sound of his lifting the latch, and he quickly slithered inside, pushing the door back close and stepping toward the front door. As he stepped, he made sure to make his footsteps heard, a clear sign that he was right where he was supposed to be. He slipped his jacket off, threw it in the corner, and swung the front door open. There they were, Mr. Becker and not Frida, but almost Frida. Agnes was taken aback by Adolf's appearance. Fritz, Mr. Becker had insisted she call him by his first name, had warned her about his injuries and appearance, but it was still startling to look at. The look he was giving her may have unsettled her more than his appearance. His eyes were locked onto her and spread wide. He looked as if he was seeing a ghost. Mr. Becker interrupted the awkward silence with an apology and introduction. "I'm so sorry, Adolf. I know you're supposed to be resting. This is Agnes, Frida's sister. She wanted to visit with you about Frida." Mr. Becker was tender with his tone. He had 2 fragile parties present and was determined to navigate these waters without creating any undesired additional turbulence. Adolf continued staring at Agnes. Agnes looked to Mr. Becker. "Adolf." Mr. Becker tried to reach Adolf in his lost depths. Adolf came to, realizing that he had been rudely staring. He blinked the dryness of his eyes and shook the webs of his mind away, then looked to Mr. Becker and nodded, motioning for them to come inside. Mr. Becker and Agnes stepped into Adolf's tiny cabin, keeping their coats on as Adolf closed the door behind them. Agnes entered first, her eyes drawn to the infamous piano Mr. Becker had described. His description hadn't done the piano justice. She turned from the piano toward Mr. Becker and raised an eyebrow. Mr. Becker delivered the same "I told you so" look that he had given the doctor when he first laid eyes on the piano. Adolf awkwardly shuffled across the room to fetch the single chair. He slid it behind Agnes and motioned for her to have a seat. She turned to look at the chair and then toward his gauze-covered face. "Thank you," she replied, lowering herself into the chair. "Won't you have a seat as well?" Adolf nervously looked around his tiny cabin and turned his hands upward, signaling surrender. Agnes looked toward the piano bench and tilted her head, offering the bench as a suggestion. Adolf looked to Mr. Becker. "Please, Adolf, sit," Mr. Becker injected. "You should be resting anyway." Adolf reluctantly pulled the piano bench out at an angle and sat on the end of it, facing Agnes. As he got seated, he looked slowly from the ground up to Agnes. She was so much like Frida, the way she dressed, her hair, her eyes, and there she sat, in the chair that Frida had sat in, died in. He was replaying the scene in his mind, but his emotional blockade prevented him from truly reliving it. The old Adolf, deep down inside of him, was screaming. "I understand that my sister dropped by your cabin on Thursday, but you didn't see her." Agnes began her official interview by establishing a mutual understanding of the facts. Adolf nodded. "Did she leave you a note?" she asked, maintaining eye contact with him. Adolf paused, then nodded again. "May I see it?" she requested with a hint of desperation. Adolf slowly pushed himself up and walked over to the corner where he kept his tools and lifted the note from underneath a bag. Touching the paper replayed even more scenes in his mind, but he resisted. He turned back toward Agnes with the note and approached her, stretching his arm to hand her the note. "Thank you." She gently reached out and accepted it, studying it intently as Adolf shuffled back to his seat on the piano bench. As she finished reading the note, she looked back to Adolf. "She admired you," she confessed, "and more than she said here." She held up the note to reference Frida's words about admiring Adolf's dedication and passion. "She spoke of you several times over the years." Adolf looked at the floor in discomfort. "She used to listen to you play during lunch," Agnes continued. Adolf looked back to Agnes. They held a gaze for several seconds. Agnes searched his eyes for any sign of information he may be holding back, and he was determined to hide his guilt and keep old Adolf at bay. "I told Agnes that you didn't see Frida last Friday, just like you told me." Mr. Becker again played the role of breaker of awkward silence. They both glanced at him, then back to each other. Agnes's face now pled with Adolf. She tilted her head slightly to the right and down, letting her dark hair hang in front of her right eye before bringing her eyes up to him. "You haven't noticed anything out of the ordinary, have you? Another note, perhaps? Strange noises? Wolves?" She sought any crumb of information. Adolf's eyes pushed to the side as he pretended to scan his memory, shaking his head until an idea struck him. "Wolves," he muttered. Agnes perked up. Mr. Becker did as well, stepping closer to Adolf. "Wolves? When was this?" Mr. Becker followed up. "Friday," Adolf responded. Agnes slowly closed her eyes and exhaled. She feared the worst, but she also felt a small sense of relief because she might actually be able to find out what happened to her sister. "Do you hear wolves often out here?" Mr. Becker sought more context, understanding that wolves were common in these woods and also that Agnes may be attaching to this theory too quickly. Agnes opened her eyes after Mr. Becker's question and looked to Adolf. Adolf nodded, and Agnes deflated, recognizing that her needle was now lost to the haystack once again. "Speaking of wolves," Mr. Becker interjected, "it will be dusk soon. We should be on our way back, Agnes." He stretched out his arm and offered his hand to her. She looked at him and reluctantly nodded, accepting his hand and pulling herself upright. "Thank you, Adolf." She spoke gently as she fought back tears. "I'm worried for my sister. Please do tell me if you remember anything or see anything." Adolf stood from the piano bench and nodded, then stepped toward the door and opened it for them. Agnes walked through the doorway as Mr. Becker followed. "Oh," Mr. Becker stopped suddenly and placed a hand on the door to prevent it from closing before he could speak the words he had just remembered. "I'll have a team clearing your path first thing in the morning so we can get the cargo carriage down it, and I'll be with a second team working on cutting a hole to get it out of your cabin." Mr. Becker was back to talking business and did so quietly to not detract from Agnes's search for Frida. Adolf nodded in understanding. Mr. Becker tipped his hat and walked quickly to catch up to Agnes. The two of them strode down the wooded path back to the road. Adolf watched as they passed behind tree after tree, catching short glimpses of what still looked like Frida walking right there with Mr. Becker until they were fully engulfed in the woods. He slowly closed the door and looked to the ground. He had succeeded in hiding his guilt. He had evaded certain disaster. His plan was still in motion. He was tired. From the walk, but more so from this charade. He needed to sleep. And he remembered that he planned to inform his mother of his plan in hopes that it would buy him some actual rest. He turned away from the door, ready to assume his sleeping position under the piano again, but something caught his eye. There, on the chair, was Frida's note. Agnes had set it down when she stood to leave. Adolf cautiously approached it, leaning down and gently lifting it from the chair seat. He scanned Frida's words again, but he didn't know why. It must have been old Adolf clawing for a few seconds of sight. Feeling nothing after looking at the note, he walked towards his piano, lowered himself to his knees, and crawled under the piano to his makeshift bed. He laid his head on the balled-up canvas and closed his eyes, not even realizing that he still held Frida's note in his hands. Adolf's eyes shot open as a fierce whinny echoed for an eternity. His face was on the ground of the dark void again, but this time he saw something a few meters from him. He couldn't make it out at first, but as it drew nearer, he saw that it was his mother's shoes. "What's this?" she asked, standing over him as he lay on the ground. He turned his head up toward her, confused at the question. She wasn't looking at his face, but something further down his body. Adolf began to push himself up to a sitting position, and as he brought his right hand in front of him to brace himself, he felt something between his fingers. He brought his hand to his face, bracing himself with his left hand in a half-sitting, half-laying position. It was Frida's note. His brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this, Adolf?" His mother pressured him for an explanation with a hint of panic. He sheepishly looked up toward her, then climbed to his feet and held the note out to her like a young student caught passing a note in class. She swiftly grabbed the note and scanned it, then looked at him with a facade of compassion. "Adolf, we've talked about this. It was necessary," his mother pled, begging him not to regress. Adolf nodded. "I know," he responded, holding up his arm to disarm her panic. 12 people. Friday. He hoped she could piece together his plan from these few words. Luckily, his mother was always his best interpreter. A massive smile of pride and excitement took over her face. "I'm so proud of you, Adolf." She grabbed his hands and then noticed that Frida's note was still in her hand. She tore it up, letting the pieces float to the ground of the void, then resumed grabbing his hands and looking him in the eyes. "Soon we'll both be safe," she whispered. Adolf nodded. "I need sleep, strength," he pleaded. Still holding his hand, she looked to her left, then to her right, seemingly checking for permission from her captor, then looked back to Adolf. "Of course, dear," she responded. "You'll need your strength for that many souls at once." Adolf's mouth formed a slight smile, pleased that his request was granted. "I plan to see you Thursday night. Until then, you'll be able to get some real rest," she furthered with a smile. Adolf nodded in understanding. She pulled him forward and embraced him tightly. He was caught off guard and hesitated to return her embrace, eventually caving. He held her tightly and buried his face in her shoulder with closed eyes. As they held each other, he felt something odd, tickling his nose. He opened his eyes slightly to see what could be creating this feeling. It was her cloak, the cloak that she had only worn in this void, that he had never seen her wear before this place. He tried to study it, to get a closer look, but the bright light appeared on the horizon, and with a whoosh, he was back under his piano. His arms were still positioned in the embrace. The note was gone. He looked around for it, sure that it must be nearby. Nothing had ever traveled with him to that place, let alone stay behind without him. That couldn't be right. If that were true, could he get stuck there? Could he bring other things in? People? And could it be possible that he could bring someone out? Could he free his mother? His mind was now spun with possibilities, unable to think about anything else. Everything else faded away in his mind. The upcoming event, Mr. Becker, Agnes, Frida, the note, the early morning and busy day ahead, and even the cloak that just moments ago tickled his nose, all faded to nothing. Could he free his mother? That's all that mattered now. He let his body relax as his mind leaped into battle with this possibility, and the need for true sleep, true rest, claimed him. His eyes faded with the flicker of his eyelids as gravity set in. Finally, for the first time in at least 5 days, he truly slept. Mr. Becker was pounding at Adolf's door with frustrated urgency. Adolf, startled at the clatter, scurried and pulled the door open. "Oh, thank goodness," Mr. Becker exhaled. "I was starting to think something had happened to you." He turned around and alerted his team. Adolf was as dazed as a bear coming out of hibernation. Mr. Becker had apparently been rapping at the door for a good while, and meanwhile, 5 men stood behind him with tools and a mission. Adolf was holding up jobs. "So sorry," Adolf pled. Mr. Becker quickly looked back to Adolf, realizing that he may have taken his words more harshly than intended. His face showed a caring concern. "Oh, no, Adolf," he explained. "We're fine. I was worried about you." Adolf understood and nodded. He stepped back and let the door swing open, triggering a flurry of commotion. The team flooded into Adolf's cabin, looking at the piano and the wall, taking measurements and planning their cuts. It was business now. Adolf quickly realized that his cabin wasn't suited to hosting parties, and he stepped outside to relieve the discomfort of being close to people. Mr. Becker was still outside. "I thought you might find your way out here." Mr. Becker smiled. Adolf nodded in surrender and rubbed his arms. It was cold. His breath billowed steam under his nose. Mr. Becker noticed his discomfort. "Otto," Mr. Becker barked. "Run Adolf's jacket to him, please." Otto, Adolf's assistant at Steinberg, was part of the crew in his cabin. He rushed out with Adolf's jacket and handed it to him. Adolf accepted and nodded thanks to Otto, who was already on his way back inside. "Big day," Mr. Becker smiled. Adolf started putting on his jacket and stepping closer to Mr. Becker. "The team on the path has 25 men clearing and leveling its way here." Mr. Becker looked toward the path at the noise echoing their way from the distance. The sounds of shouted orders, brush falling, and axes colliding with their target. Adolf looked impressed. "Precious cargo," Mr. Becker said in a genuine and thankful tone. Adolf was flattered and looked to the ground. "Oh, I brought you something." Mr. Becker's demeanor shifted to excitement as he reached into his coat and pulled out a small book. Its cover simply had the word Albtraum, nightmare, embossed on its dark green surface. He stretched out his hand, holding the book to Adolf. Adolf reached out and slowly accepted. "It's going to be a long day of waiting," Mr. Becker revealed. "I thought you might enjoy your time more with this." He motioned to the book with a smile. Adolf opened the book, realizing what this was. This was a book about the nightmare, the mare, the Alp, the stories that might help him free his mother. He wanted to frantically explore it, but he knew that his reactions to the stories would be odd to Mr. Becker. He couldn't take this journey in Mr. Becker's presence. "If you don't mind," Mr. Becker interjected, seeing that Adolf was eager to dive into the book, "I would like to build you a fire over here and set up your chair. You won't want to go back inside for a while." He rubbed his hands together and lifted them to his mouth to warmly blow into them. This was also an exclamation point to his offer, driving home to Adolf that a fire would be a good idea for everyone. Adolf nodded without hesitation. He was indeed cold, and he had only been outside for a few minutes. Mr. Becker's offer to set up a warm fire and a seat for him to focus on his book was everything he could have hoped for. He was in his own world, cozied up near the fire in his chair with a blanket, a mug of coffee, and his book, all provided by Mr. Fritz Becker. The world around Adolf buzzed with activity. Inside his cabin, his piano had been covered for protection, and an orchestra of axes and saws sang in a fluid rhythm, cutting away at the left wall of his cabin, making their way down markings that drew a rectangle 3 meters long and 2 meters tall. A much larger orchestra of axes, saws, horses, and men drew closer to the cabin every minute down the path. Adolf was oblivious to everything, locked into his book and his side quest to rescue his mother. He was particularly unaware that alongside the path-clearing team was another team, a search party. Agnes had recruited 4 friends to join her on a search for any sign of Frida, starting with the woods alongside the path. These friends, 2 young couples, knew Frida well, and when Agnes confided in them about wolves in these woods being the current likely scenario, they didn't hesitate to join her search. The 5 scoured the leaves and horizon alongside the path-clearing team, an unofficial alliance strategically formed by Agnes. She had overheard Mr. Becker telling Adolf about the path-clearing team, and she knew that if her search did uncover something, she may need the kind of help that 25 strong men could provide. She had not arranged with Mr. Becker to enlist his men if this possibility was to become a reality. Instead, she took a calculated risk, betting on her faith in Mr. Becker's character and fatherly love for her sister. She was sharp, a trait that she shared with her sister. The path-clearing process was a work of art. Men cleared brush in front. Behind them, more men shoveled away peaks and filled valleys. Behind them, more men smoothed the loose dirt. Behind them, one man, the team elder, advanced the cargo carriage inch by inch. The men moved like a clock's gears. They knew their race against time and the importance of the cargo returning on this path. A single, unsoftened bump in this path could be catastrophic to the piano and their livelihood. Agnes was determined to find something, anything. She wasn't sure that she would find her sister in these woods, but she was closer to sure than she's been about anything else to this point. This was her only lead. She needed to find something. Her search party had only been searching for an hour, but had found no sign of Frida yet. They advanced step by step closer to Adolf's cabin, flanking the path-clearing team, clinging to hope. Adolf was enthralled by the stories in Albtraum. It was a collection of lore and other traces of the Alp throughout history. A typical German proverb simply says, "The elf deceives me." In the 13th century, Heinrich von Moringen's fifth love song starts with, "Full many a man is bewitched by elves, thus I too am bewitched by great love." Later, prayers were common to ward off the Alp's demonic threats. Münchener Natzing reads, "Elf, you shall remain no longer. Elf's sister and father, you shall go out over the gate. Elf's mother, true and mare, you shall go out to the roof ridge. Let the mare not oppress me. Let the trute not pinch me. Let the mare not ride me. Let the mare not mount me. Elf with your crooked nose, I forbid you to blow on the following people." The Alp would sit on a sleeping person's chest, eventually causing them to startle awake with gasping terror, unable to move under its weight. They could be summoned and controlled by witches. Some believed they would ward off Alps with broomsticks under pillows, horseshoes, a mirror on the chest, and even crosses. Adolf was learning so much, and while he struggled with his ignorance of this apparently common story, he knew that his upbringing was atypical, and nothing that he had learned yet would help him free his mother. The next page displayed a crude illustration based on a painting by Johann Heinrich Füssli called The Nightmare. It made Adolf's heart sink. There stood the mare he had faced, whom he had dreaded, and an odd creature about half the size of a human, with pointy ears and a smile made from pure evil, sitting on a sleeping woman's chest. At least based on what Adolf had read so far, he assumed she was asleep. She looked closer to death than sleeping, and the Alp looked proud of its work, in its original elf demon and mare forms. Adolf was frozen, but a word on the opposing page caught his eye. Cloak. He quickly abandoned the pit in his stomach that seeing the Alp and mare had caused, and he poured his focus into the page that discussed the cloak. He learned that the Alp wears a cloak of invisibility, giving it the ability to shapeshift and turn invisible. He was confused. Mr. Becker had told him that the Alp was a shapeshifter, but the cloak couldn't be the source of that power. If it were, then his mother would have that power as well. Or, it can't be, he thought, knowing in his bones that it was true but not allowing his mind to accept it. The cloak his mother wore was only worn by the Alp. He closed his eyes in utter defeat. Old Adolf reemerged, flooded with emotion. He remembered the thoughts and feelings that he had experienced when he confronted his mother immediately after taking Frida's life. He remembered thinking, "This is not the woman I remember," and feeling nothing but contempt for this thing that sullied her memory by wearing her likeness. He remembered how fleeting those thoughts and feelings were. They quickly disappeared when he learned that his mother was in danger as well. He froze in realization that the danger she was suddenly in was a ruse, a reaction to his getting too close to the truth. And it worked. He was disgusted by his weakness. He was the fool, swayed with minimal effort, a puppet controlled by a demon. He was preparing to take 12 more lives for his mother, for this Alp. He was embarrassed. He was angry, but more than anything, he was unsure. If he had learned anything at this point in his journey, it was that he knew nothing. He had grown untrusting of his feelings, of his mind, and so he felt that this was damning evidence, but he had not fully accepted it. He stared into the flames, lost in the riddle that his mind had become. Where do you go when you don't know where to go? He asked himself. Forward, he answered. Adolf's mission was to illuminate a path using the words within these pages. He had already uncovered a potentially pivotal theory. What else would he find? As the world continued buzzing around him, His oblivious gaze into the flames, his cabin being cut open, the path being halfway cleared, and the search for Frida continuing, he looked back to his book, hoping to find more answers inside, resuming his search. It was dark. A muted whinny sounded off, and suddenly, a great curtain fell. As it fell, it flooded the tiny cabin with light, revealing a great pile of canvas. The wall of Adolf's cabin fell with a mighty thud, and the men who had enlisted the help of a horse to pull it down dropped their ropes in victory. The saws were set aside. The mission was now to extract the piano through the fresh opening, but this was a milestone that the men deserved to celebrate. Mr. Becker smiled as he rewarded the men with rest and walked toward the path, heading to check in on the path-clearing team. He saw Adolf by the fire, lost in the book he had brought him, and kept his distance. He didn't want to interrupt, and he had work to do. He would be ready for the cargo carriage shortly, and he needed to find out how long they would be, so he disappeared into the trail's camouflage. As Mr. Becker grew closer to the sounds of progress that echoed from the path-clearing team, he was pleased that they were on schedule. This was an uncommon challenge, and his plans were executed like clockwork. He was proud of his men. He was also proud of his plans. He scanned the trail ahead to bring their progress into focus when something in his peripheral caught his eye. It was a bright blue color, much too vibrant to be worn by one of his men. He couldn't make it out at first, but as he walked further into the path, the blue drew nearer to him. Eventually, he could see that it was a person, a woman, and then finally, he could see that it was Agnes. What in the world? He wondered aloud. He then saw another person further into the woods, walking parallel to Agnes, then another even further into the woods. He could see the path-clearing team ahead, working away, but he couldn't focus on them. What were Agnes and these people doing walking through the woods? Then he realized exactly what they were doing. They were looking for Frida. He was overridden by guilt. Here he was, moving heaven and earth to bring a piano from Adolf's cabin to Steinberg, and he should be looking for Frida too. The captain in him knew that he had to complete his mission for the company, but his heart ached with regret and shame. He felt awful. Mr. Becker was the kind of man who didn't want to feel awful, and when he did, he took swift action to resolve that feeling. He stepped toward Agnes, walking off the path and into the woods. Agnes and her search party had been looking for hours and found nothing. She didn't know what to expect and was trying not to get disappointed quickly. She tried not to expect a miracle, but a growing part desperately needed one. It was beginning to show on her face. The cold brought tears anyway, but her brow and mouth showed stern focus mixed with worry. She heard something through the loud commotion of the path-clearing crew. The sound of steps and leaves coming toward her. She swung her head toward the sound to see Mr. Becker approaching her, much closer than expected. It startled her. "I'm so sorry," Mr. Becker announced, raising his hands to show no harm. "The noise from the path must have made my calls difficult to hear." She raised a hand to the chest of her vibrant blue coat, telling her heart that it could slow down now. "Mr. Becker," Agnes said, sweetly greeting him. "Anything?" he asked with a look of cautious hope. Agnes shook her head and looked to the ground. Mr. Becker exhaled in disappointment. "It's a lot of ground to cover," he said while looking into the vast woods around them. "When my team is done, I'll have them join you." He was intent to help, and not just because he felt awful. He cared for Frida. Agnes looked up at him in shock of his generosity, forming the best smile that looming grief can shine through. Her eyes glistened with gratitude, and she nodded. "Tomorrow as well, if needed," he added. She hadn't thought past today. Perhaps it was the growing piece of her that believed in miracles, that ignored the possibility of not finding anything today. Tomorrow did not exist for her until this moment. Would she keep searching as long as it took until something was discovered? Absolutely. She would search until she could no longer walk from old age, and after she was gone, she would come back in spirit and wander these woods for eternity until she found Frida. This was the only path with promise. She would not abandon it, no matter how cruel the journey may become. "Thank you," she responded with a resolute tone. She was now a soldier on a mission. She would not quit, and she needed all the help she could get. Mr. Becker tipped his hat to Agnes, turned around, and resumed his trek to the path-clearing team. In the other direction, a smoky haze filled the sky above the trees near Adolph's cabin. Adolph was still seated near the fire, glued to the book. He was quickly scanning pages now, realizing that he didn't have time to entertain any information that wasn't going to aid in clarifying his quandary. The information about the cloak presented a strong possibility that his mother was the Alp. Rather, the Alp was assuming the likeness of his mother. He still wasn't completely convinced, so he quickly searched the book's pages, hoping to dispel or confirm this theory. As he turned another page, nearly 3/4 of the way through the book, he saw an image of an eye. The eye appeared to be damaged, as if layers of the iris had been eaten away in several spots. He froze. His gaze locked onto this drawing of the damaged eye. He had seen this eye before. It was his mother's eye. Not the mother that he remembers from life, but the mother who had appeared to him in the darkness, who had convinced him to take Frida's life, convinced him that her soul was in danger and that the only way to free her was by taking 12 more souls. Underneath the eye's image in the book, the description read, "The Alp's Evil Eye." He slowly inhaled the gravity of this finding, closed his eyes, and let his head fall back. The cloak, the evil eye, they belonged to the Alp, not to his mother. His mother was gone, and any comfort that he had felt by seeing her in the darkness was fabricated, nothing more than a memory's evil shadow. His mother wasn't in danger because this wasn't her. Adolph didn't need to take 12 more souls because this wasn't her. But the Alp would haunt him forever unless he followed through. He would never be able to sleep again if he refused this mission. He would be tormented forever, imprisoned by a demon who had tortured enough people already to have a compilation created for reference. He felt trapped by circumstance, but he returned to the book, opening his eyes and lowering his head back into the pages. "One can render the Alp powerless by removing its evil eye," he read, then played the potential scenarios in his mind. He only encountered the Alp in the void, surrounded by literal nothing. How could he possibly find the means to remove the Alp's eye? He returned to the book again, eager to uncover a guide to the impossible task of removing the eye, but the book left him wanting. It didn't tell him how to remove the eye, only that doing so would render the Alp powerless. He turned the book over on his lap, frustrated. He had finally learned the truth and stumbled upon a way to break the Alp's control over him, only to have no way to achieve this feat feasibly. He imagined digging his fingers into her eye socket and plucking the eye with his bare hands. Knowing that it was the Alp and not his mother did little to remove the scarring image of seeing his mother eyeless and bleeding. Could he do it? Could he become a monster himself to defeat the monster that tortured him? Whose still gauze-covered face tilted upward while the book laid face down on his lap. As Mr. Becker drew nearer, he thought Adolph might be asleep. He focused on Adolph's eyes as he continued his approach. If Adolph were asleep, he wouldn't bother him, but he wasn't sure how anyone could sleep with the noise of today's mission. Adolph wasn't asleep, of course. He was lost in thought, trying to figure out how to remove the Alp's eye and break its control over his life. Mr. Becker saw his eyes open and staring off into the distance. Mr. Becker looked into the woods in the direction Adolph's eyes indicated, and he saw nothing but trees slowly discarding their leaves to the ground. He looked back to Adolph, thinking he might be asleep with his eyes open. "Adolph," Mr. Becker softly announced. Adolph did not respond. He just kept staring at nothing. "Adolph," Mr. Becker softly repeated. Adolph repeated his response of no response. Absolute stillness. He could have been a statue. He could have died right there in the most picturesque of ways to go. He didn't even appear to be breathing. "He's not breathing," Mr. Becker thought in a tone of panic. His face now shifted from caution to concern, and he now had to abandon his previous approach of subtlety. "Adolph!" Mr. Becker now spoke slightly more alertly than a normal conversational level. Adolph startled, nearly out of his chair, catching himself only by the grace of Mr. Becker's outstretched hand. He looked up at Mr. Becker and touched his chest to curb their panic. He shook his head in disappointment at himself, and Mr. Becker helped him return to his seat. No, Adolph, I'm sorry," Mr. Becker said. "I thought you were—" Adolph looked at Mr. Becker in surprise, which transitioned to understanding as he realized that he had been staring off into space. He held up the book and motioned to it, then to his head and chuckled at himself. Mr. Becker understood. Yes, well, I'm sorry for startling you, Mr. Becker continued, but I wanted to talk to you about coming back to Steinberg with me and your piano. He looked to Mr. Becker, awaiting the imminent ask. I would like you to accompany the piano during transport every step of the way. It is your masterpiece, after all, Mr. Becker explained. Adolf expected this much and nodded in agreement. One more thing, Mr. Becker continued. I would like you to stay at my home tonight. An awkward silence filled the air. The previously clattering noise, the sound of progress, faded to a nearly undetectable level. Adolf looked toward his cabin. He hadn't thought this far ahead, but he certainly couldn't stay in his cabin tonight with it being torn apart. He would, but he wasn't lying about seeing wolves in these woods, not near his cabin, but he understood that he needed to portray them as a major threat because of Frida, because of Agnes. He looked to the ground and thought, then back to Mr. Becker and shook his head, declining his offer. After several seconds of confusion from Mr. Becker, he opened his mouth to object, but before he could make a sound, Adolf spoke. Under piano, he said softly but firmly, pointing toward the cabin. Mr. Becker followed the point and saw the piano visible through his open cabin door, waiting to be extracted and loaded into a wagon. He couldn't see it from where they stood, but he knew it was the spot on the floor where Adolf had slept for ages. He formed a half smile, looked to the ground, and he chuckled. Adolf wanted to stay with his piano. Mr. Becker admired his dedication to it. He looked back up to Adolf and nodded. Of course, he responded. We'll make sure you're comfortable. And with that, Mr. Becker launched his determined gait toward the cabin, toward the extraction team, ready to put them into action. Soon, Adolf's piano would be loaded onto the cargo carriage, and the journey to Steinberg would begin. Adolf watched him walk away with admiration, and then he looked down at his book and he remembered all of his woes. That man, walking away, was a good man. He shouldn't die. Only Adolf could save him from the Alp, his mother, his piano, and him. He must solve this. He must figure out a way to remove the Alp's evil eye. It's madness, he thought. But then he thought about everything else happening in his life, and he realized that this was no more mad than any of those things, and his brow pointed from worry to determination. It was now late in the afternoon. The path-clearing team had successfully paved the way for the cargo carriage to reach Adolf's cabin and smoothly deliver the piano to Steinberg. The extraction team had successfully removed the piano from the cabin, and both teams came together to load it onto the carriage with great care. Inside the giant cargo box, Adolf's piano was covered in blankets, canvas tarps, and rope that secured it to the carriage in every direction. Most men had accomplished their missions and prepared to disband when Mr. Becker called for their attention. Excellent work today, men, Mr. Becker proudly hailed. The transport team will head back with the carriage. Everyone else, please join the search party on the path. Mr. Becker motioned to the path while several men looked at each other with confusion. You all know Frida, he still projected, but now with a solemn tone. Standing at the back of the cargo carriage, Adolf stared at the engineering marvel that held it in place, froze, and every hair on his body stood on end at hearing her name. She has been missing for nearly a week, and her sister, Agnes, is leading the search party. His tone began transitioning to that of a general asking his men to march into battle. Adolf slowly approached the crowd to get a better view of the scene, afraid of what he might hear. This was the first he had heard of a search party. Wolves in these woods might have taken her. Mr. Becker spoke about the wolves as if they were the enemy. Or she could have gotten lost, injured. She may be alive, waiting for someone to find her. Confusion was now absent from the faces of the men. They nodded as Mr. Becker spoke, ready to march into battle. Adolf's gauze-covered face looked in awe as another nightmare was launching. Be the one to find her, Mr. Becker charged. With that, all but the 6 men in the transport team walked back down the trail to meet Agnes and search for Frida. The space between Mr. Becker and Adolf emptied of bodies, and Mr. Becker caught a glimpse of Adolf's fearful gaze. He stepped toward Adolf. Adolf, seeing Mr. Becker approaching, pocketed his expression. Are you ready? Mr. Becker asked, motioning toward the carriage. Adolf nodded, and the two stepped toward the carriage, embarking on a journey to bring Adolf's piano to its new home at Steinberg. With the path smoothed, the carriage could proceed at a healthy pace, still cautious due to its cargo, but much faster than the men walking down the path to join Agnes. They parted to let the carriage move through, and Adolf, sitting in the rear with his piano, watched out the back as they converged again in the wake of the carriage. Mr. Becker sat across from him, also watching his men as they faded into the path's horizon. Then, something vibrant blue in the woods caught Adolf's eye. It was just off the path behind Mr. Becker's side of the carriage. Mr. Becker noticed his intent focus and craned his neck to see what Adolf had spotted. He also saw the blue, and although it wasn't clear through the brush, he knew it was Agnes. He turned back to Adolf, nodded, motioned to the vibrant blue mystery, and said, "Agnes, let us hope they can find something." Mr. Becker then looked back down the path, watching as the piles of brush and limbs passed by. Adolf's fear returned, but he was determined to hide it, so he too looked down the path. What will happen if they find her, he thought, letting the hypothetical actions play out in his head. Wolves didn't take her. She wasn't lost. She was buried deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees and leaves, but Adolf's cabin was the closest landmark to her grave. He would become the prime suspect in her death. He swallowed a lump in his throat, realizing that, even if he succeeded in rendering the Alp powerless, he would still have to answer for Frida's death. He pondered on this as the carriage traveled down the trail toward the road, and as they turned onto the road to head toward Steinberg, he shifted his focus. Spending time and energy worrying about what might happen after he defeats the Alp was futile. He needed a plan to defeat the Alp first. It had to be brilliant. It had to be unexpected. It had to be something his mother, or the Alp pretending to be his mother, would not anticipate. The piano arrived safely at Steinberg and was now resting in a new home, one much more worthy of its grandeur. The showcase room at Steinberg was built specifically for occasions like Friday's event. It was lined with wooden panels, thick wine-red curtains, and lanterns. A single skylight above the center of the room set the stage and beamed light onto Adolf's piano. Adolf and Mr. Becker stood and quietly reflected on the piano's beauty. The soft diffusion of the skylight brought out even more of the piano's intricate details and curves. Adolf felt proud of what he had built for the first time since this nightmare had begun. He saw its beauty. He felt the gravity of its rarity. "We'll finish up setting up the room tomorrow with chairs, and I'm sure you'll want to tune your piano after that journey." Mr. Becker broke the silence. He looked tired. It was getting late, and the skylight faded as the sunset progressed. Adolf's young assistant, Otto, entered the room holding a stack of blankets and a pillow. "Ah, thank you, Otto." Mr. Becker reached and accepted the stack of bedding, then looked to Adolf. "Under the piano, I assume?" Adolf nodded, and Mr. Becker walked to the piano to lay Adolf's bedding in place. While he unfolded the blankets and prepared a spot for Adolf that was at least familiar to him, he turned his head toward Adolf with another thought. "You'll need a suit," he said, almost surprised that he hadn't thought of it sooner. "I'll have my tailor come tomorrow morning and prepare something for you." Mr. Becker rose and motioned to the completed pallet bed under the piano, motioning to it and looking to Adolf for approval. Adolf nodded in thanks, and Mr. Becker walked toward the door. "Get some rest tonight, Adolf," Mr. Becker offered. "You've earned it, and you're going to need it." He placed a hand on Adolf's shoulder, squeezing it, and stepped out of the door, leaving Adolf alone in the ceremonial scene with his piano and a makeshift bed. Adolf looked at the bedding as he stepped toward it. Tonight would be the only night he would sleep without visiting the void, without seeing his mother, the mare, the Alp. It was almost too good to be true. Even though he knew that a treacherous journey awaited him on the other side of this slumber, he didn't care. He crawled underneath the piano, into the blankets, drifting off within minutes. As the skylight's beam dimmed to nothing, the room faded to black, and Adolf finally slept. Thursday began with the full force of Mr. Becker's determination. Steinberg was bustling with activity and commotion as teams of men prepared the showcase room for performance, the production floor for inspection, and to rejoin the search party with Agnes. Mr. Becker marched from one group to another, delivering their marching orders for the day. After deploying all but the search party team, he finally approached them and was joined by another man who was not part of the Steinberg crew. "Men," Mr. Becker barked to get their attention, "this is Eric. He and his dogs will be joining you today in the search." Eric was a hardened-looking older man. He had a stern, weathered face that did not react. His arms were folded. His boots were dirty. He was prepared for this mission. "Eric will split you up. We need to cover as much ground as possible today." Mr. Becker looked them each in the eyes to convey the importance of his words as he spoke. "Good luck." With that, he reached out and shook Eric's hand as the gang of men joining the search party filed out the door. Mr. Becker then turned toward the showcase room, where Adolf was tinkering with his piano. As Mr. Becker passed through the doorway, he saw that Adolf had been working for quite some time already. Parts were strewn about the area around the piano, and Adolf was leaning over inside the piano's body, performing adjustments for tuning. Mr. Becker looked at the parts on the ground, confused. The piano appeared to be intact. What did these parts belong to? He then looked back to Adolf, who had not yet noticed that he was standing there. The last time Adolf was leaned over inside of a piano, he had a terrible accident. Mr. Becker didn't want to startle him and risk a repeat of that nightmare, so he decided to wait patiently. After a few seconds, Mr. Becker's tailor entered the doorway and signaled to Mr. Becker, who raised his hand in acknowledgement. He now had no choice but to interrupt Adolf. Mr. Becker slowly stepped toward Adolf and the piano, leaned forward, and softly said, "Excuse me, Adolf," with bated breath as he waited for a response. Adolf carefully backed out of the piano and stood straight, facing Mr. Becker. Mr. Becker couldn't believe his eyes. Adolf's bandages were gone, and although the marks on his face were still present, they had healed tremendously in the few short days since the incident. On top of that, Adolf looked rested. He looked like a different man than the Adolf he had seen for the past few days. After realizing that he had been frozen in shock for several seconds, Mr. Becker looked to the tailor, motioning him to come forward. "Adolf, if we can interrupt you for a moment, Carl will take your measurements, and he'll be working on your suit for tomorrow," Mr. Becker explained. Adolf nodded and laid down his tools. He hadn't rested that well in so long that he woke up early and had already accomplished most of his tasks for the day. He needed to work ahead to clear his mind because he still had to figure out his primary mission, breaking the Alps' power. Carl began setting up his workspace to take Adolf's measurements, and Mr. Becker charged his stride out of the room toward his next mission. "I'll return shortly," he announced to Adolf and Carl. Adolf watched as he walked out of the room, then looked down to Carl, the tailor, who was already starting measurements of Adolf's lower half. He hadn't been measured since he was a young boy, and he had forgotten how uncomfortable it made him. He felt like a puppet, a statue, unless the puppeteer, the tailor, manipulated an arm or other part. Determined to avoid making eye contact with Carl, he looked at the only things in his direct line of sight, his piano and his tools. Adolf was very particular with how he kept his tools. He had a weathered leather roll that he had used to keep his tools organized for years, and although the tuning hammer, mutes, and tuning fork were out of their assigned spaces because they were in use, all of his other tools were nestled into their assigned pouches. One tool, in particular, held his gaze. It was called a Siever's voicing tool. It was a tool used to adjust the sound of the piano hammers and was a flat-headed holder of 6 needles. The needles picked at the hammer's felt to adjust the resulting tone. On the Steinberg production floor, they simply called it the felt picker. It was a petite and plain-looking tool. There was nothing remarkable about it, but he couldn't look away from it for some reason. Even after Carl began taking measurements of his upper half and moved his arms around in puppet fashion, Adolf continued staring at the felt picker, lost in its simplicity. On the side of the road near the mouth of the trail to Adolf's cabin, Agnes paced as she waited for the rest of her search party to arrive. Yesterday's search hadn't revealed any sign of Frida, but these woods were vast, and there was still a lot of ground to cover. She looked down the road into Heisenberg for a sign of anyone. Nothing. She turned and continued pacing in a pattern that she was sure to wear into the ground if she kept going much longer. She stared at her feet as she paced from point to point, looking to the woods or the road as she turned on her repetitive march. Mr. Becker had told her that he would be sending 20 men and a friend who raised hounds to join the search party today. She was glad to have reinforcements. The weight of Frida's disappearance was crushing. She had been gone nearly a week. Any hope that she was still alive was all but snuffed out in Agnes's mind. That didn't matter anymore. She still had to find her. She had to know. A faint sound caught her attention. Hooves, wagon wheels. The cavalry was approaching. She swung her gaze toward the sound and saw the growing shape of Steinberg's horse-drawn cargo carriage moving closer. The morning sun strobed through the near-barren trees to illuminate the carriage intermittently, revealing a larger image with every stride, wheel revolution, gallop, and burst of light. She stopped pacing and awaited the carriage's arrival at the mouth of the trail. As it stopped on the road next to her, men poured out of the covered cargo wagon, more than Agnes had expected. As an army built around her, she swelled with gratitude. Eric, with 4 large Munsterlinde hounds, parted the crowd as he moved toward Agnes. Their eyes met as he approached her, and she nodded in appreciation to Eric and then to the hounds. She looked around her, surrounded by 21 men and 4 hounds, and cleared her throat as she prepared to address the party. She spotted a small stump, freshly created by some of these same men during the clearing of the path, and stepped toward it, climbing up on it to see the lot of them at once. "Thank you for being here." She turned while speaking to be sure and address each and every man present. "Mr. Becker asked for volunteers, and you answered that call. I know you wouldn't be here if you didn't care for my sister." She connected her gaze with alternating members of the crowd, delivering her sincere thanks directly to the front steps of their souls. "Frida has been missing nearly a week." Agnes hung her head as speaking those words into reality collided with her heart. Tears welled in her eyes. She did not wipe them away. Instead, she looked back to the men of the search party, unashamed of her emotion. "Let's bring her home," she closed, stepping down from the stump and walking toward Eric. 4 groups of 5, Eric barked to the men. 2 groups on each side of the trail, 1 shallow, 1 deep. Fan out. Hold your lines. Stay within shouting distance. Eric continued delivering his orders as the men segregated themselves into groups. Agnes waited patiently, allowing Eric to lead the charge for today's search and awaiting her orders. Eric looked to Agnes as the men began to move toward the trail. "You're with me, and I'm with them." He nodded toward the hounds. Agnes nodded in understanding and pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, extending it toward Eric. "Frida's," she explained. Eric nodded and accepted the bit of ornate cloth. He would use it to give his hounds Frida's scent, and they would, hopefully, lead them to her somewhere in these never-ending woods. "One more thing," he barked loudly to the men, many of whom were already headed down the path. "Those willing will camp tonight and start again at first light tomorrow. We'll be headed deep into these woods." He looked toward Agnes, conveying his commitment to the search and checking her willingness to do the same. She nodded. This was her only mission, and she would do whatever it took. Adolf placed his tuning tools back into their proper pouches with great care. Once released from the tailor's puppeteering, he was able to return to and complete his tuning. Normally, he would treat the area around the piano as his workspace, but this space was much different. The ceremonious lighting, the wine-red curtains, the dozen chairs now facing the piano. This was not a workspace. This was a stage. He had to take great care in cleaning up his mess, including picking up the parts that were strewn about, the parts that had confused Mr. Becker when he laid eyes on them. These were the remnants of the 4th pedal. Adolf had dismantled the pedal first thing that morning, disconnecting the trigger that tapped into the piano's abilities. It could no longer steal souls with its song. Adolf had no intention of taking 12 souls on Friday. He now had a plan to defeat the Alp. "Just gorgeous," Mr. Becker proclaimed as he burst through the doorway again, seeing the full glory of Adolf's piano with the skylights beamed now at maximum intensity, the room now fully set up, and Adolf's work area cleaned up. He continued walking toward Adolf and the piano, looking around the room and taking in the full scene with a smile of satisfaction. "First thing tomorrow, I'll be by to pick you up." He turned to Adolf and was back to talking business. Adolf's face was perplexed at the need to go anywhere, since the performance would be here in this room. "You can get cleaned up and put your new suit on at the tailor's," Mr. Becker explained. Adolf hadn't cleaned himself in a while, and it was obvious. This wasn't shocking to Adolf, but he simply hadn't given it thought over the past week. He wasn't embarrassed, but he agreed that he would need to freshen up, so he sheepishly nodded in response to Mr. Becker's plan. Mr. Becker smiled and nodded in understanding, then turned back to the doorway, stepping toward his next mission. He stopped just before turning back to Adolf. "Adolf," he said. Adolf, now tying up his leather tool roll, looked up to Mr. Becker. "Get some rest tonight." Mr. Becker smiled before turning away again and marching out of the showroom. Adolf looked down at the leather roll in his hand, walked toward the side of the room where his tools could be hidden, and placed the roll down gently. As he returned to the piano, his felt picker, The tool that had earlier caught his gaze was no longer in its assigned pouch. It remained there on the piano keys, alone, left behind. With the ground of the trail disrupted by the path-clearing team, the hounds, pulling Eric and Agnes behind them, were at a disadvantage. They continued down the trail, flanked by wings of men who searched the ground, all desperate to find a sign of Frida. They reached the remains of yesterday's fire, and the hounds gravitated toward Adolf's cabin. Agnes watched their interest in the cabin increase as they drew nearer, but she realized this wouldn't reveal any new information. Frida had been to Adolf's cabin on Thursday. She delivered the note. The hounds sniffed around the cabin's closed door, then walked around the cabin, out of view from Eric and Agnes. Both expected to see them round the visible corner of the other side of the cabin as they orbited it, but they didn't appear. They had vanished. Agnes looked to Eric, who continued watching the cabin intently while walking toward it. Still no sign of them. Eric looked back to Agnes with concern and quickened his pace toward the cabin. Agnes quickened behind him. As Eric rounded the corner where they had last seen the hounds, he was surprised to see a large piece of the cabin's wall lying on the ground. The cabin was open from the side, and the hounds were inside the cabin. None of the hounds had opened, the initial cry to sign that they had found something, but they were studying the interior of the cabin thoroughly. Agnes caught up to Eric and saw the dogs inside the cabin. Confusion grew on her face. The dogs showed particular interest in the chair, the only piece of furniture in the tiny, now empty cabin. Agnes looked around in confusion. She had sat in that chair. Perhaps the dogs confused her scent for Frida's. Eric inspected the chair closely, wiping his hand on a residue collected on the chair leg brace, and bringing his hand up to his eyes and nose for closer examination. He rubbed the residue between his fingers, then looked to Agnes and said, "Ash." Her brow furrowed with further confusion. How was ash on the chair? She looked back at the burnt ground they had passed on their way to the cabin and realized that the chair must have been near the fire yesterday, but had been returned to the cabin before the team left. She was correct. Mr. Becker, ever the gracious house guest, had returned the chair himself. That still didn't explain Frida's scent on the chair, but Frida wasn't there now. They needed to press on. And if the hounds picked up her scent here at the cabin, maybe they could follow it from the cabin to wherever she went next. Eric and Agnes were both thinking this, and without speaking a word, looked at each other with mutual understanding of their next move. Eric called the hounds out of the cabin and led them across the ground surrounding the cabin. At the rear of the cabin, the hounds stopped and stood facing the woods behind it, sniffing the air. Adolf had wrapped Frida's body in a canvas and carried her through the woods. The hounds would not find her scent on the ground. Any branches that had grazed her body as Adolf carried her would have only touched the canvas that shrouded her, her now burial robes. If the hounds were going to catch any scent, it would have to be through canvas, several feet of dirt, and leaves deep within these woods. Even with Eric's hounds, the chances of finding Frida were meager. The hounds stepped forward into the forest and began searching the ground aimlessly. Agnes looked at Eric, whose already stern face was now peppered with disappointment. There was no clear trace of Frida. The cabin was a dead end. Agnes looked to the ground and shared disappointment, but she and Eric both stepped forward into the forest, following their hounds as they wandered deeper into the wooded abyss. The previously bustling scene at Steinberg was fading as the end of the workday neared. The production floor was pristinely cleaned and organized. The showcase room's ceremonious beam was less intense as the sun neared the horizon, but the room was still glowing with majesty. Off to the side, Adolf sat in one of the audience chairs. He was looking down at his hands, which now held the felt picker tool. He gripped it tightly with his right hand, pressing the needles into the palm of his left hand to test their sharpness, then released his grip and let the tool lay in his open palms. He continued to examine it, not looking up. "We'll be closing up soon," Mr. Becker announced to Adolf as he leaned his head into the doorway. Adolf looked up from his tool to Mr. Becker, forcing a grin and a nod. "Get some rest. Big day tomorrow." Mr. Becker leaned back out of the doorway and disappeared. Adolf looked down at the tool in his hands once more, then looked up to his piano and took a long, deep breath, lowering his chin as he exhaled and assumed the posture of determination. He wasn't nervous about tomorrow's performance. His only focus was tonight's battle with the Alp. Darkness had fallen on the woods, and the search party had made camp for the night. The 20 men, 4 hounds, Eric, and Agnes, all settled in around a large fire. Mr. Becker had sent enough provisions with the men to provide basic comforts, food, coffee, blankets. Today's search did not lead to Frida, but Agnes was determined not to let disappointment rule this night. She asked the men to hear stories of their interactions with Frida. "I've heard several of your names mentioned," she announced, looking around at the men who were getting comfortable around the fire. "I know that several of you, have felt the sharp end of her wit on more than one occasion." She smiled as she looked them each in the eyes. "Please, I'd love to hear any lighthearted stories you might have about her," she pled through her lingering smile. She continued scanning their faces during the next several seconds of silence, the crackling fire popping loudly in the absence of any speak. "Oh, I have one," a gruff voice boasted from the back of the crowd. Agnes leaned for a better view of the speaker, who stood once he realized she couldn't see him. It was Hans, one of the larger, more brute workers at Steinberg. He was built and often acted a bit like a bear. He removed his hat and held it in his hand as he looked at Agnes, the fire's light reflecting on the bald skin on top of his head. "Frida always teased me about being weak," he chuckled. Agnes couldn't help but look surprised, given his size. The other men just nodded, knowing exactly what Hans was referring to. "She would ask me to pick up something too heavy, mind you, then act disappointed when I'd said I couldn't," Hans recalled. Agnes and the men chuckled. "She would call me the bear, and when we had to use horses to move heavy things, she would say..." Hans chuckled again, then scrunched his face to raise his pitch to imitate Frida. "The horse is mightier than the bear, huh?" The men burst with laughter. Agnes shook her head while smiling. She could easily envision Frida saying that. "That's disappointing, bear," Hans quoted Frida, breaking after the words left his mouth as tears formed in his eyes. Agnes felt great compassion for this big bear of a man. The men hung their heads, hiding the emotion that moved through the crowd like a wave, originating from Hans. "Thank you," Agnes said, tenderly, as her eyes welled up too. "I've got one too." Another man sprang up to his feet, eager to lighten the mood. Agnes turned to him and smiled. Man after man gave their recounts of Frida's wit and humor. They laughed, they smiled, they cried, and after hours of exchanging memories, they began to settle in for a night of sleeping under the stars. Agnes walked up to Eric, who was not part of the story exchange, but had been looking on to it, sitting with his hounds and keeping watch. "Will you be sleeping tonight?" Agnes asked Eric. Eric looked around at the men and then back to Agnes. "We'll be keeping watch shifts," he explained. "I'll be the first watch, and I'll rouse one of them when I need to retire," he said, motioning to the men. Agnes nodded in understanding, turned around, and approached her designated bed for the night, a blanket on top of a leaf-covered ground near the fire. She doubted that she could actually sleep, but she would need rest for another search tomorrow morning, and the sun would be here sooner rather than later. As she neared her blanket, the hounds roused and growled, startled by something in the darkness of the woods. Each slowly arose to his feet, peering into the darkness to get a look at whatever had spooked them. After less than 2 minutes, the hounds had relaxed. Whatever was out there had moved on, away from the group. Wolves? Agnes wondered, staring into the blanket of darkness long after the hounds and Eric were no longer on alert. Finally convinced it was another dead end, she lay down on the blanket, her face lit by the flickering flames, and closed her eyes. Eric sat on the ground and leaned against a tree, continuing his watch while the men and Agnes rested under the towering trees and stars beyond them. At first light, the wheels of progress were set in motion. Mr. Becker climbed into his carriage and set off toward Steinberg to fetch Adolf. He was visibly excited. This was a big day for Steinberg, for him, for Adolf, and in his bones he believed that this was big for the entire piano industry. He was to be a proud part of history on this day. It was more than a chore to fetch Adolf that he set out on that morning. It was the beginning of his destiny's birthday. Agnes and her search party packed camp and prepared to push the search deeper into the woods. The blankets were rolled up, the provisions packed, and the fire snuffed out. Agnes hadn't been this dirty since she was a young girl. She combed the leaves from her hair with her fingers and wiped the dirt from her face with her handkerchief, a twin to Frida's. She didn't care what she looked like, but she didn't want to feel dirty because the feeling was a distraction, and she needed 100% of her focus on the search. "Ready?" Eric asked, flanked by his hounds. Agnes pocketed her handkerchief and nodded. Eric waved a hand at the men, who had already formed their ranks and were just waiting for the signal to move. As they set off, the group transformed from a cluster into 2 wings extending from Agnes, Eric, and the hounds. The doors to Steinberg rattled and then flew open, flooding the dark entryway with light. Mr. Becker's silhouette stepped through the doorway, and he marched in with great enthusiasm. With his hands still in his coat pockets, he took large strides toward the showcase room, eager to get Adolf out the door and to the tailor. As he stepped through the doorway to the showcase room, the faint morning light fueled the skylight just enough to dramatically light the piano in an otherwise pitch-black room. The overhead light on the piano cast a dark shadow underneath it where Adolf was sleeping, but Mr. Becker could make out the lumpy shape of blankets. He was surprised that Adolf wasn't already awake and had his bedding put away for the day. "It's time to go," Mr. Becker announced, continuing his stride toward Adolf and the piano. No answer. "Adolf!" Mr. Becker barked, but still no answer. As he reached the piano, he bent down to Adolf's bedding and extended his hand to shake him awake. But his hand didn't meet with Adolf's back as Mr. Becker had expected it to. He reached for the ground underneath the piano, thinking perhaps Adolf was lying flat. But his hand was met with only a wadded-up blanket and something wet. Mr. Becker's face was fraught with confusion as he continued grasping, but he only found more damp blanket. Where was Adolf? What was this wet substance? He pulled his hand back and arose, moving his hand into the skylight's beam to examine the liquid still on his fingers. It was red, and it dried to attack quickly on his skin. This was blood. Mr. Becker's heart sank. He jumped to the side of the room to grab a lantern, clumsily lighting it and bringing it back underneath the piano. The lantern illuminated a mess of blood on the blanket and ground, but no sign of Adolf. Mr. Becker gasped and brought his bloodied hand to his mouth in horror. He leaned back, leaving the lantern on the ground to illuminate the bloody scene. "Mr. Becker?" A voice from a silhouette in the doorway called out. "Adolf?" Mr. Becker swung his attention to the doorway. The shadowy figure paused before responding. "No, sir, it's Otto, sir." Mr. Becker deflated. "Sir?" Otto sheepishly questioned. "There's a trail of blood leading out the back door," Otto explained, his voice quivering in fear. Mr. Becker sprang to his feet and looked to Otto, then to the bloody scene under the piano. Otto followed Mr. Becker's gaze to the lantern-lit, blood-soaked blanket, and his eyes grew with increasing terror. What happened to Adolf, sir?" Otto stammered in shock. Mr. Becker looked at Otto with glistening eyes. "Adolf is missing." The two held each other's gaze and shared a momentary bond of trauma before Mr. Becker realized that he needed to take action. He had to lead, no matter how frightful the circumstances. He began to pace and take deep breaths while his chaotic mind tried to formulate a plan. Adolf was missing, but there was a trail to follow. The critics would be arriving in just a few hours. This bloody mess had to be cleaned up before they arrived. 20 of his men, plus Agnes and Eric, had camped out and would still be in the woods. If they had found something yesterday, he would know by now. They would be resuming their search and pushing deeper into the woods. After a full minute of pacing, Mr. Becker stopped. "Otto," he began, "focus on cleaning this up." Otto, who had been standing frozen and bewildered, staring at Mr. Becker as he paced, gulped and reluctantly nodded as his eyes returned to the bloody mess. Mr. Becker stepped toward the doorway. "I'll find Adolf." He looked toward the ground as he stepped through the doorway and into the brighter light of the production floor, seeing the blood trail that Otto had mentioned. He had been so focused on his mission when he arrived this morning that he hadn't noticed the blood on the floor. He could see now that the trail exited the showcase room and headed straight to the back door, in the middle of the building's opposite end. He followed the trail to Adolf's workstation on the production floor. Adolf must have grabbed something to slow the bleeding because the blood spatters exiting the station were far less frequent. He followed the now thinner trail to the back door, and as he reached for the handle, he saw that it was smeared with blood too. He carefully reached out and grabbed the handle, not caring about getting more blood on his already covered hand. The door swung freely open. It had been unlocked and not returned to a fully closed position. Mr. Becker leaned out of the open doorway, and his eyes followed the blood-stained bits on the ground as they led to the back side of the building. He stepped out of the building and followed the trail leading past the building and to the road. Mr. Becker stopped as he reached the road and looked down it in the direction that the trail turned. It was the direction of Adolf's cabin. He exhaled in defeat. There was no sign of Adolf on the road as far as he could see, and the trail would become difficult to follow. He needed Eric and his hounds. The search party would be deep into the forest now, and reaching them with word would take hours. He also still had guests coming and was responsible for today's event. More men would be arriving at Steinberg now, and he could direct them to assist Otto with cleanup and preparation. As he turned back to the building, he looked down to see blood staining his pants, his coat, and his shirt. He held up his bloody hand and turned it over. He had to get cleaned up too. He lowered his hand and set stride toward the front entrance. He would assign most men to assist Otto, but one man would set out on horse to tell Eric that he was needed back in town. Redirecting Eric would severely weaken the search party, but the men would remain with Agnes. Only Eric and the hounds would change course. A blood trail is the kind of thing Eric's hounds could track down quickly, while they may not be on any kind of a trail on their current search. It was the strategic move that made the most sense to Mr. Becker's business mind. He swung open the doors to Steinberg and was met with a group of 10 men who had arrived for the workday. They had seen the blood trail in the building and Otto cleaning up the showcase room. They were confused, and seeing Mr. Becker covered in blood pushed them beyond confusion into fear. Mr. Becker looked around at each of their shocked faces and raised his hands to calm them, not realizing that his blood-covered hands only fueled their fright. He looked at his hands, now realizing his error, lowered them, and announced, "Adolf is missing, and he's clearly injured badly." He grabbed a rag from the shelf near the doorway and began wiping the blood off of his hands. "I followed the trail to the road. We need Eric's hounds." He looked through the crowd of men while he continued wiping the blood from his hands. "Who can get word to Eric the fastest?" One of the men raised his hand, and Mr. Becker quickly nodded to him. "Go. Time is our enemy." The volunteer rushed out the door to fetch his horse and raced to the search party to deliver the word. Mr. Becker looked to the remaining men. "Everyone else, I'm sorry, but we must clean this up before our guests arrive." They looked at each other and nodded with the same reluctant understanding that Mr. Becker expressed, and then they disbanded and began grabbing supplies to erase the trail of blood from Steinberg. Mr. Becker turned around and exited Steinberg, walking back to his carriage with a cleanup mission of his own. The search party was pressing deep into the woods now, far past any sign or path of civilization. It was a vast sea of leaves with a labyrinth of trees that forced the party to twist and turn their way forward. They trudged on through the thick leaves that blanketed the ground, and though the day was early, Agnes felt like their chances of finding anything out here were dwindling. She spotted something up ahead, a small clearing. As they drew nearer, she could see something lying on the ground in that clearing. She looked to Eric, who had also spotted the object, and they quickened their pace. The hounds had already quickened their pace as well, picking up on the object's scent. Eric whistled to the men who flanked them and pointed to the clearing, and the line of men began to fold in toward it. The hounds reached the clearing first and opened with a cry. They had found something. Agnes followed, out of breath, and as she exited the labyrinth into the clearing, she saw that the object on the ground was a person. Although the person was face down, she could see that it was a man and that he was covered in blood. Beside the man, the leaves had been pushed out of the way to reveal a large spot of freshly disturbed earth. Eric and the men arrived. Eric motioned for the men to roll the man over to identify him. The men, confused because this was not Frida's body, hesitantly stepped forward and rolled the body over to its side. It was Adolf. The wounds on his face had reopened, and his clothing had been slashed all over his chest and arms. He had been viciously attacked by something. "Not wolves," Eric observed. Agnes looked at him with confusion. Eric looked from Adolf's body to Agnes to dispel her visible confusion. "The body's still here," he explained. The men shook their heads in disappointment at the scene. A few of them rolled Adolf's body to its back and prepared to roll it up in blankets for transport when one noticed the patch of disturbed earth beside the body. It was the size of a large grave. He looked at the other men and shouted with outstretched hand, "Shovel!" One of the men handed a shovel forward, and several others grabbed their shovels to join in. They had to dig up whatever was buried there. It might help explain what happened to Adolf. The sound of a gallop through leaves approached the group. Eric and Agnes turned around to see a man on horseback speeding toward them, winding through the labyrinth of trees. They walked toward the edge of the clearing where the man and horse would enter and awaited an explanation of his hasty visit. He slowed his horse as he entered the clearing but did not waste time dismounting, leaning down to speak to Eric directly. "Mr. Becker needs you and your hounds," he panted, out of breath from the ride. "It's Adolf. He's—" Before he could finish the words, the scene in the clearing caught his eye. He saw the men digging, and beside them, he saw Adolf's body. Adolf wasn't missing any longer. He was here. He was gone. Back at Steinberg, Mr. Becker sat at Adolf's piano, performing for the critics seated around the showcase room who were in awe of the piano's aesthetic beauty and lush sound. Mr. Becker was a formidable pianist in his own right, but his real passion was for the craft of creating the piano. This was his first time playing this piano, Adolf's piano, and while he performed Bach's Goldberg variations, his mind was elsewhere, with Adolf and with Frida. As he reached the final aria, a tear fell down his cheek. As an audience member, it appeared that the piano's song so enraptured him that it had pulled the emotion from him, and while this piano was certainly capable of doing so, it was Adolf and Frida who felled this tear. As he closed Bach's variations, a thunderous applause shook the room as critics sprang to their feet. Mr. Becker slowly looked from the piano's keys to the audience, forcing a smile and a nod. As he stood from the piano, the critics mobbed him with questions and requests for orders. The showcase was an outstanding success. However, Mr. Becker spotted something in the back of the room. The doors had been swung open, and the man who had rode out this morning to deliver word to Eric was standing in the doorway, out of breath and looking utterly defeated. Mr. Becker's concern grew as he examined the man's demeanor. "Excuse me for a moment," he begged of his audience, stepping through the crowd to speak with his exhausted and visibly troubled man. As the man explained to Mr. Becker what was discovered in the woods, Mr. Becker's demeanor slumped. He hung his head, closed his eyes, and exhaled defeat. He looked back to the crowd and knew that he had to pull himself together to answer their questions, so he stood tall, recollected himself, and stepped back toward them. He forced himself to act as if everything was fine, fulfilling his duties as leader of Steinberg. But throughout it all, one question repeated in his mind. What happened to Adolf last night? Adolf was alone once more in the hallowed halls of Steinberg. Everything was pristinely prepared for the next day's event, except for his pallet bed on the floor underneath the piano. In the showcase room, the lanterns were dark, and the moonlight provided an eerie glow to Adolf's piano, as if the moon knew that Adolf was about to march into battle. Adolf stepped toward the piano, still clasping the felt picker tool, and knelt to crawl into his familiar bed once more. He didn't bother covering himself with the blanket. He laid flat on his back and folded his hands on his chest, pushing the tool's needle end into the cuff of his right sleeve and gripping the handle tightly with his right hand. He closed his eyes and began to take long, deep, controlled breaths. As he attempted coaxing his body to sleep, his mind resisted, racing with thoughts of Frida, Mr. Becker, Agnes, and his mother. He tried to quiet his mind, focusing on his breath, but repeatedly his mind was interrupted by a flash of the faces of those he cared for. His eyes and brows twitched as he continued fighting to quiet his mind. Suddenly, something changed. His eyes weren't open, but he could tell that he was in the dark void again. It sounded different, like a large empty room made of marble, where every tiny sound echoed infinitely. Footsteps approached slowly, echoing with increasing volume until they stopped near his feet. Adolf's eyes shot open, and he saw his mother standing at his feet, smiling at him. "How do you feel?" she asked, tilting her head and leaning toward him. Adolf forced himself to a sitting position, forced a smile, and responded, "Ready," with empty eyes. His mother was pleased to see this. He had locked away all of the emotion that would have surely interfered or caused hesitation as he headed into tomorrow's mission, taking 12 souls at once. Adolf pushed himself to his feet and faced his mother like a soldier ready to be commanded. She was even more impressed with his demeanor, looking him up and down and nodding in approval. "Do you feel rested after last night?" she asked. He gave a single nod in response, staring straight ahead while she began stepping in orbit around him, continuing her inspection. "This will be no easy task," she added while continuing her orbit. "It will take every bit of energy you have, and more." She returned to Adolf's front side and stopped to face him. "You will need to rest again tonight," she explained, her eyes accenting her words to show that this was a gift to Adolf. She would not be keeping him here tonight, but would let him return for rest and preparation for tomorrow. Adolf nodded in thanks but kept his stoic demeanor. "Adolf," she said his name tenderly, stretching out her right hand for him to accept. "I'm so proud of you." He looked down at her outstretched hand and then to her face, now conveying the tender emotion he yearned from his mother. His eyes began to glisten, and he brought his left hand up to meet with hers. She smiled at this and stretched out her other arm, inviting him in for an embrace. He hung his head as the glistening in his eyes turned to a flood, and he stepped toward her to accept the embrace. They held each other tightly. "My boy," she whispered. Adolf's eyes shot open as he felt the tickle of her cloak again, and he knew it was time to make his move. He reached his left hand up, grasping the cloak and her hair tightly, then pulled. Adolf's mother let out a shriek of pain, but before she could take any defensive action, Adolf slid the felt picker tool from his cuff and pressed it into her disfigured eye, the Alp's evil eye. "No!" she shrieked, but Adolf pressed the needles of the tool into her eyeball. As the needles entered the eye, blood shot out in several directions, covering Adolf's face and chest, but he kept his firm grasp on her hair to control her and kept the pressure of the felt picker tool on her eye. The void echoed with demonic screams. These were no longer the screams of his mother. As he moved his right hand to the handle of the tool to pluck the Alp's eye from its socket, his mother, blood-covered and wailing in demonic tones, raised her knee and kicked him away. Adolf fell to the ground, quickly scrambling back to his feet to finish the task, but his mother was gone. He began quickly scanning the darkness, but before he could spot her, the mare screamed from behind him, charging straight toward him. He jumped out of the way just before the mare reached him and watched as the mare flew by. It was now bloodied, and the tool was still pressed into its eye. The Alp had switched forms from Adolf's mother to the mare. The mare disappeared as quickly as it came, and another sound, a shrill shrieking hiss, flew at Adolf from the other direction. A small creature, fur and blood-covered, wearing the cloak and carrying the tool in its eye, charged Adolf and jumped onto him. Adolf yelled as the Alp slashed at him with its sharp claws while clinging to his chest. It slashed his face, reopening his striped wounds and his chest, tearing through his clothes and drawing immediate blood. Adolf wanted to grab the tiny Alp and throw it, but he knew that he had to finish the job, so he wrapped his arms tightly around it with a forceful bear hug. The Alp let out a piercing scream, and Adolf quickly grasped the handle of the felt picker tool hanging from the Alp's eye. He pulled and twisted with all of his might until the Alp and the eye freed from each other. Adolf and the Alp fell to the ground in opposite directions, the Alp screaming with its hands to its face, and Adolf still holding the tool and the eye. Adolf was injured, bleeding profusely, but he pushed to his feet, staring at the flailing Alp with contempt. He dropped the tool and the eye to the ground, raised his foot, and stomped with all of his force. The Alp screamed louder, and the light that transported Adolf back home flooded in hurriedly, quickly blinding the scene. Adolf awoke under his piano. His heart was racing. He had done it. He had defeated the Alp and destroyed its power over his life, but he was bleeding profusely. He felt the wounds on his face and chest and quickly realized that he would not survive the night. He had already lost a great deal of blood, and these wounds were too severe to treat himself. He crawled out from under the piano and immediately knew what he had to do. He stumbled out of the showcase room and through the production floor to his old workstation, grabbing rags to slow his bleeding, then pressed on out of the back door, around the building, and to the road. In the darkness of night, he bled and stumbled down the side of the road out of Heisenberg until he reached the trail to his cabin. He pressed forward, coughing up blood, using the trees to help him stand until he came up to his cabin. He didn't stop there. Instead, he continued deeper into the woods. He stumbled through the leaves from tree to tree as his life force faded, but he was determined to reach his destination. He came up on a glow in the distance. It was the camp of Agnes and her search party. As he trudged through the leaves, he heard the hounds in the camp stir. He had captured their attention and the attention of Agnes. He watched as the hounds relaxed, but Agnes kept staring in his direction. She couldn't see him in the darkness, but he stared back at her. When it was safe to move, Adolf pressed on, maintaining a safe distance from camp. He was growing weaker by the second, and he wondered if he would reach his destination, but he was determined. This would be his final act. Failure was not an option. Finally, as the sunrise shot hints of light through the barren trees, he reached the clearing where he had buried Frida. He pushed the leaves that covered her grave to the side, ensuring that the search party would find her, and then he collapsed next to the grave. With his blood-covered chest on the ground, he turned his face toward Frida's grave and stretched out his hand to its turned dirt. Frida's body would be found, ensuring this was his final act, and while it did not undo any of the terrible things that had happened, Adolf needed her to be found. He slowly closed his eyes and released his final breath. Piano Man, written and narrated by Dusty Thunder.